Good morning. Welcome to the boardroom of the National Transportation Safety Board. My name is Debbie Hersman. It is my privilege to serve as the chairman of the NTSB. I'm joined by my fellow colleagues, Vice Chairman Chris Hart, Member Robert Sumwall, Member Mark Rosekind, and Member Earl Weiner. Today we meet before the start of the busy flying season to address general aviation safety. Over the last decade, the number of GA accidents has averaged more than 1,500 a year. That's more than 4 every day. More than 5,200 people have perished in these accidents over the last decade. During this same time period, the GA accident rate has plateaued with repeated crashes and needless loss of life. While there is much work being done across the general aviation community through efforts like the GA-JSC Joint Steering Committee with its FAA and AOPA co-chairs, and by other organizations such as the Flight Safety Foundation, the NBAA, GAMA, and EAA, today we meet to discuss what we, the NTSB, can do to help bring the accident rate down. I see 3 steps. The first is to understand what is causing the accidents. The next step is identifying preventative strategies. And the last step, getting the word out to the GA community. First, understanding. The NTSB is charged with investigating every civil aviation accident. Our investigators see firsthand the causes and contributors. This morning, we will hear more from our safety experts about what they see on the job every day. Second, identifying preventative strategies. Last year, we held a 2-day forum drawing on experts across the GA community. It's why GA safety is on our most wanted list and why one of our board members, Earl Weiner, is leading those advocacy activities. It's why we have a team of safety experts to build on what they have learned in their years of investigating these general aviation accidents. Third, getting the word out to GA pilots and maintenance technicians. This is essential. You can have the best accident prevention strategies in the world, but unless they are communicated effectively to the people who need to know and who will benefit the most, they won't save a single life. This is why I'm so pleased that today we have with us the greatest experts on the current battle to improve general aviation safety. The people who serve on the front lines every day are NTSB investigators. They serve as one-person investigative teams, often climbing mountains to access remote accident sites, dealing with victims' families, answering media questions, coordinating with local officials, and making sense out of burned and fragmented parts. What they do is nothing short of extraordinary, but the 57 regional investigators do it hundreds of times a year. In addition, they serve as safety ambassadors to the general aviation community. They attend local drills and speak to pilots, first responders, flight students, and many more about how to improve general aviation safety. And through the relationships that they have built on the ground, they have created some real safety accomplishments. More than 400 safety accomplishments between 2008 and 2012. Here's an example of a safety accomplishment. After a fatal accident, our investigator worked with officials at a North Carolina airport to improve its lighting system. Done. No official NTSB safety recommendation from Washington was needed. I know I speak for the board when I say thank you to those in the field who are doing such excellent work on behalf of this agency. Dr. Meyer, will you please introduce our team?
Yes, ma'am. Good morning. Seated to my right is John DeLisi, the director of our Office of Aviation Safety. And next to John is Kathy Gagne, the project lead, Chris Shaver, air safety investigator, and to Chris's right is Jennifer Rohde, air safety investigator, and at the end of the table, Craig Hatch, air safety investigator. Seated behind Craig is Jeff Marcus from our Office of Safety Recommendations, And to Jeff's left is Dennis Diaz, Air Safety Investigator, and to Dennis's left, Air Safety Investigator Elliot Simpson. Jim Ritter, who's the Deputy Director of our Office of Research and Engineering, and sitting next to Jim is David Toshin, General Counsel, and Tom Zoller, Director of the Office of Communication. And finally, at the back table are 3 Air Safety Investigators, Michael Hune, Tim Sorensen, and Joshua Kothra, who we'll be hearing from later in the morning. And finally, Jennifer Bishop is doing visuals for us today. Kathy Gagne, the project lead, has the opening statement.
Good morning. Each year, NTSB regional investigators investigate about 1,500 accidents in which about 475 people are killed. Because of the need for improvement in the decade-long plateau in the GA accident rate, the NTSB placed GA safety on its most wanted list. This action targeted GA safety as one of the agency's advocacy priorities. Last June, the Safety Board held a forum, General Aviation Safety, Climbing to the Next Level. During the forum, representatives from industry, academia, and other federal agencies discussed various strategies for reducing the GA accident rate. Improved pilot education, training, and risk management skills were among the areas identified as important to improving general aviation safety. The topics of the 5 draft safety alerts that we are presenting today were developed based on NTSB GA accident data and information gathered at last year's GA Safety Forum. Each safety alert defines a GA safety problem, gives statistics on the problem, and provides examples of completed accident investigations and ways to avoid or mitigate the problem to prevent these types of accidents in the future. We chose to focus on the personal flying sector of GA because personal flying accounts for the vast majority of GA activity and the greatest proportion of GA accidents. Three of the safety alerts focus on topics related to some of the most common defining events for fatal GA accidents in the personal flying sector. These include accidents involving aerodynamic stalls at low altitude in daylight visual weather conditions, which is a type of loss of control accident, reduced visual reference accidents, and accidents involving pilot inattention or inappropriate responses to indications of aircraft mechanical problems. An additional safety alert covers risk management strategies for pilots because effective risk management is essential for preventing all types of GA accidents. And because aviation maintenance technicians play a critical role in GA safety, we've included a safety alert that addresses risk management strategies for mechanics as well. Each safety alert also provides links to free safety education resources such as web-based publications, online courses, live seminar schedules, and other materials. Most of the resources that each safety alert references were developed or promoted by the Federal Aviation Administration Safety Team, or FAST Team, and the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association's Air Safety Institute, a division of AOPA Foundation. The content of the educational materials is designed specifically with the intention of reducing the GA accident rate and promoting an aviation safety culture within GA. The content focuses heavily on using the lessons learned from past accidents to apply risk management principles to identify, assess, and effectively mitigate common accident causes and factors. The presentations that staff have prepared for today discuss the circumstances of the accidents featured in each safety alert. Staff selected these accidents because they exemplify some of the common, repeat accident causes, factors, and scenarios we see in our work every day. The investigations for each of these accidents have already been completed, and their probable cause statements have been adopted. Completed accident reports make for excellent educational outreach tools to help other pilots learn about how to mitigate the risks associated with common accident causes. In each accident presentation today, the investigators will discuss what opportunities may have been available to the pilot or mechanic that could have enabled them to avoid the tragic outcome. The investigators will also discuss the broader safety issues from their personal perspectives of having investigated repeatedly other accidents with similar scenarios. These discussions include the lessons that investigators most wish that pilots or mechanics would learn from their work. The purpose of discussing potential missed opportunities associated with an accident and lessons learned is not to admonish the pilot or mechanic for making mistakes, but rather to help other pilots and mechanics learn from those mistakes and avoid making them themselves. These are the types of discussions that investigators typically lead during GA outreach activities, such as those that we might plan for these safety alerts. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the staff who worked on this project. In addition, several other regional investigators provided accident case examples or volunteered their assistance. These include Mr. Van McKinney and Mr. Jose Obregon, whose accident cases are among those featured today. Their support is greatly appreciated. This concludes my overview. We'll now lead a discussion on the first of the 5 draft safety alerts. Our first draft safety alert, prevent aerodynamic stalls at low altitude, addresses the problem of fatal aerodynamic stall accidents that occur during maneuvering flight at low altitude in visual weather conditions. Based on our accident investigations, we have found that many GA pilots are failing to avoid the conditions that lead to an aerodynamic stall, recognize the warning signs of a stall onset, and apply appropriate recovery techniques. Many stall accidents that occur in visual weather conditions result when a pilot is momentarily distracted from the primary task of flying, such as while maneuvering the airport traffic pattern, during an emergency, or when fixating on ground objects. Mr. Chris Shaver will present our first accident scenario.
Thank you, and good morning. Just after takeoff on a VFR cross-country flight, a Piper PA-12 airplane collided with tree-covered terrain following a loss of engine power near Delta, Alaska. The 250-hour commercial pilot was killed, and the airplane sustained substantial damage. Multiple witnesses observed the takeoff and saw the airplane make a steep left turn back toward the airstrip just after the engine lost power. This map shows the airplane's approximate takeoff flight path, the location of the witnesses, the approximate point the engine lost power, and the accident site. The airplane departed to the northeast and passed over the witnesses at an estimated altitude of 200 to 300 feet. All of the witnesses stated that the engine did not sound normal as the airplane flew overhead. Witnesses stated that shortly after passing overhead, the airplane's engine went quiet, and the airplane made an immediate left turn, followed by a nose-down descent into the trees. As you can see, there's a road adjacent to the airplane's flight path and a large open field approximately 300 yards to the east. This photograph shows the airplane's wreckage at the accident site. The NTSB determined that the probable cause of this accident was the pilot's decision to make a low-altitude turn back to the airport following a loss of engine power, which resulted in an aerodynamic stall and loss of control. The reason for the loss of engine power could not be determined. In looking at this accident, there are a number of areas where opportunities existed that may have affected the final outcome of this flight. Pilots should know their options before they take off. This accident pilot did have available options that would have required only minimal maneuvering. Don't rely on instinct. Your instinct will usually try and tell you that the runway equals safety. You will lose time, altitude, and airspeed deciding what to do. It is always better to accept what you have in front of you. And do not attempt a course reversal at low altitude. They don't call it the impossible turn for nothing. And in any situation, maintain control of the airplane and fly all the way to the ground. There are measures that GA pilots can take to avoid being involved in accidents like this. Few pilots would disagree that a loss of engine power after takeoff is one of flying's most challenging situations. GA pilots need to train for these events. More than just a flight review every 2 years, every takeoff is an opportunity to train and sharpen skills. It has been said that one difference between a professional pilot and an amateur is an amateur pilot is surprised when something goes wrong. A professional is surprised when everything works right. Brief your takeoffs. Know your departure area. Simulate emergencies every chance you get. I can speak from personal experience that these actions can save your life. And in an emergency situation, save yourself, even if it means damaging the airplane. Metal can be repaired much simpler than the human body. This concludes my presentation. The next speaker for this topic will be Ms. Jennifer Rohde.
Thank you. Good morning. During a local flight, a Beech S-35 airplane, commonly referred to as a Bonanza, impacted a spent quarry just east of the Lake in the Hills Airport near Lake in the Hills, Illinois. The pilot and flight instructor, who had thousands of flight hours, were killed and the airplane was substantially damaged. The pilot and flight instructor were flying in the traffic pattern, conducting touch-and-go landings on runway 26. The wind was reported as 220 degrees, between 11 and 22 knots. Witnesses observed the airplane turning from base to final in a very steep bank. The description from the witnesses, the damage to the airplane, and the ground scars were consistent with the airplane being in an aerodynamic stall and spin at the time of impact. This photograph depicts the main wreckage as it came to rest in the spent quarry. The NTSB determined that the probable cause of this accident was the pilot's excessive bank angle while on approach to land, which resulted in an inadvertent aerodynamic stall and spin. This accident presents several different lessons that other pilots and flight instructors can learn from in order to prevent similar accidents. The pilot and flight instructor did not compensate for the stronger crosswinds and overshot the final approach course. The pilot and flight instructor attempted to correct for overshooting the final approach course by increasing the bank angle. By doing so, they increased the stall speed of their airplane. Instead of terminating the approach and continuing in the traffic pattern for a second attempt, the pilot and flight instructor allowed the situation to degrade until aircraft control was lost and a subsequent stall ensued. In the past 10 years, I have investigated multiple accidents where the pilot lost control of the aircraft while maneuvering in the traffic pattern. As both a commercial pilot and flight instructor, it is frustrating to continue to see these same mistakes over and over again. I view these stall accidents as preventable through increased vigilance during the flight and raised awareness of the characteristics of a stall through education and flight experience by the pilot or pilots responsible for the safe conduct of the flight. Pilots should be aware of the effects that wind has on their traffic pattern and adjust their flight path accordingly. If they have drifted in the traffic pattern to the point that excessive bank angles and maneuvering are required to get back to the final approach course, they are no longer in a stabilized approach and should initiate a go-around. A go-around and second approach to the runway may take a few more minutes and require more fuel. However, it's a small price to pay for the alternative of stalling the airplane in the traffic pattern and not living to fly another day. The next speaker will be Mr. Craig Hatch.
Good morning. While on a local pleasure flight, about 10 o'clock Central Daylight Time, an experimental, amateur-built Vans RV-6 airplane impacted water just off the shore of Lake Michigan. The private-rated pilot received serious injuries and the airplane was substantially damaged. Prior to departure, the pilot contacted another friend and told him to be on the beach and watch for the airplane. The accident pilot held a private pilot certificate and had accumulated about 105 total flight hours, with about 15 hours in the accident airplane. The pilot had a standing arrangement with the plane's owner to borrow the airplane. The pilot stated that as he approached the beach, he was at treetop level, was slowing down, and had his attention focused outside the cockpit. He added about halfway through a tight turn, there was a bump drop, and the left wing lost lift. That was the last thing he remembered. Several witnesses reported the airplane making low-altitude passes over the beach. On the fourth pass, the airplane appeared to drop, impacting the water just offshore. The NTSB probable cause in this accident was the pilot's low-altitude maneuvering, which resulted in an inadvertent stall and subsequent impact with the water. The pilot's aggressive maneuvering, such as large bank angles, can affect the stall speed of the airplane, as noted in the table. Although not a focus of the investigation or the safety alert, Experimental amateur-built aircraft may not have the same stall characteristics as a certified airplane, may not have documentation of stall speeds, or the installation of warning devices such as a stall horn or angle of attack indicator. Based on the pilot's flight experience, it is likely that he didn't realize the stall characteristics of the airplane or the effect of bank angles on stall speeds. The natural progression of moving up to more performance from our typical training aircraft is something as new pilots we can look forward to. However, transitioning to new aircraft is critical time in any pilot's career, regardless of flight experience. The experimental amateur-built study conducted last year highlighted some of those hazards. While the type of aircraft was not a focus of this investigation, avoiding the temptation to show off, recognizing the warning signs, and avoiding aerodynamic stalls at low altitude would have prevented this accident.
The 3 accidents that staff just presented are summarized in the draft safety alert, Prevent Aerodynamic Stalls at Low Altitude. The safety alert also provides links to educational resources, and it offers pilots the following advice.
Seek training to ensure that you fully understand the stall phenomenon, including angle of attack concepts and how elements such as weight, center of gravity, turbulence, maneuvering loads, and other factors affect an airplane's stall characteristics. Remember that an aerodynamic stall can occur at any airspeed, in any attitude, and with any engine power setting.
Remember that the stall airspeed marked on the airspeed indicator typically represents flight speeds at 1G at the airplane's maximum gross weight in the specified configuration. Increasing bank angle can increase stall speed exponentially. Remember that reducing angle of attack by lowering the airplane's nose at the first indication of a stall is the most important immediate response for stall avoidance and stall recovery.
Manage distractions when maneuvering at low altitude so they do not interfere with the primary task of flying. Resist the temptation to show off for other people or a camera. This can be a deadly distraction. Understand the stall characteristics of a new airplane. This may differ substantially from an airplane from which you have more flight experience. This concludes the staff presentation on the safety alert topic. We are prepared to answer your questions at this time.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentations. We'll begin the questioning with Member Sumwalt.
Good morning. Ms. Gagne, how were the 5 topics that we are discussing this morning, how were they chosen? Were these the highest risk areas, the most accidents, the most deaths? What criteria was staff using to select these 5?
You know, it's interesting because different studies slice the data in different ways, and part of what came out of the safety forum last June is that we had the top 5 categories by occurrence event included for fatalities in the personal flying sector, GA, were loss of control was the biggest one, which actually that's a very big bucket because that catches everything from your VFR stalls to your spatial disorientation, controlled flight into terrain, system or component failure power plant, unintended flight into IMC, and system component failure non-power plant. So those 5, we took and we sliced them up based on mitigation strategies to get the 3 main safety alerts that we have. So we have the aerodynamic stall and VMCs addressed. The reduced visual reference one will hit the CFIT and the spatial disorientation, and then we have the 2 mechanical ones, and then risk management would hit them all.
Great, thank you. I remember when I met with staff about 3 or 4 weeks ago on these proposed safety alerts, one of the things I said is that I asked, and Ms. Gagne, maybe this is for you or perhaps Mr. DeLisi, I said, you know, these are really good, a lot of effort has gone into it, but can it really move the needle? And I equated it to like every time my daughter gets in the car, I say, drive carefully, and it makes me feel better, but I wonder if it really affects her driving performance. And I was curious, you know, are these safety alerts going to make us feel better, like we're doing something? But is it really going to move the needle? And Mr. DeLisi, I think it was you that had a reply that I felt comforted in. Do you recall what that reply is, or can you address that?
Sure, thank you. There certainly are opportunities for there to be safety data out there for a pilot that's interested in it. But I think the unique aspect that these safety alerts will allow us to do is to outreach to those pilots who haven't yet had their accidents. Our staff launches 250 times a year. So let's think about 2014, 2015. There will be accidents in those years. Our goal through these safety alerts is to try to catch a pilot who hasn't had their accident yet. And through the compelling stories of the experiences our investigators have had, maybe change the course of history.
Thank you. I appreciate all the hard work staff has done on this. And Member Weiner, I want to commend you, because I think it was you who collectively brought the attention to the fact that we as an agency need to put more focus on general aviation. This is where most of the accidents in aviation are occurring, so let's focus on those. And this is a technique that you used in all of your years in commercial aviation safety, is that let's focus on those areas where the problems are. So I applaud what you have brought to us in that respect. And of course, the staff has done the heavy lifting on this, but I think your leadership on that has gone a long way. I remember when I met with staff again 3 or 4 weeks ago, that the rhetorical question came up about how do we reach the unreachable? And somebody said you can't reach the unreachable. Well, I'm going to suggest that there are no unreachable people. It's just at what point in their lives are they reachable? I think that everybody at some point in their lives has some significant emotional event which causes them that they need to listen and they need to reach out to somebody else. It may be that their wife kicks them out of the house. It may be that their best friend gets killed in an airplane. It may be that they scare the heck out of themselves and they say, wow, I really need to pay attention. So I'm going to contend that there are no unreachable people. It's just a matter of timing. And if we put the material out there, then there will be a smorgasbord of material to choose from. And I think that we're doing the right thing by going ahead. We're recognizing that this is where the accidents are. So let's go ahead and let's put the material out there. So thank you very much.
Member Weiner.
Thank you. I'm particularly pleased to be at this board meeting with a focus on GA. Having been involved in GA in more years than I really want to admit to. On the commercial side, as Member Sumwalt pointed out, we've made tremendous progress, and over the last decade or 12 years, we've reduced the accident rate more than 80%. So it's been a long time since we've had the loss of a large airplane with all the passengers and crew on board. The latest major one, the last major one, was probably the A300 in New York City in 2001, and the last regional was in more than 4 years ago in Buffalo. But during that time, as we pointed out, as was pointed out by the chairman, the accident rate for GA has been flat. But actually, it's a little worse than that. I'm sure it's difficult to see this from here, but for personal flying, the accident rate's actually gone up by 20% in the last decade. And that's the wrong direction. You know, what other areas do we have accident rates going up? The fatal accident rate, in fact, has gone up by almost 25% over that same period. So I'm really hopeful that what we're doing here is going to move the needle. We do great accident investigations, but the knowledge that we generate during an accident investigation is only the beginning, because what we really need is to figure out how to change behavior. We need changed behavior on the part of pilots, maybe changed behavior on part of passengers, controllers, mechanics, even changed behaviors on the part of the families and friends who fly with these pilots. I know there have been some very successful activities up in Alaska where the circle of the pilot is involved in helping to modify pilot behavior. So the real effect is going to be felt when we see what we are talking about here actually put into practice, when we see The accident rates go down when we see pilots' behaviors changed. And it's not entirely clear to me how to do that. As Member Sumwalt pointed out, we need to reach the unreachable. The unreachable sometimes do a fair amount to protect themselves from being reached. We have to figure out how to get into those folks. We've had discussions as recently as yesterday talking about some of the techniques we might use to do that. How to take advantage of the type clubs, how to take advantage of those folks who are the enthusiasts of particular kinds of airplanes. One of the types of airplanes we talked about here was the Vans RV, and the experimental amateur-built study showed that the accident rate for amateur-built airplanes is about 4 times higher than for certified airplanes. There are a lot of enthusiasts, and perhaps Vans RVs have a lower accident rate because of the Vans Air Force enthusiasts who band together to pass information around about the particular flight characteristics. The same goes for Beechcraft. American Bonanza Society is one means of getting to those folks. Cirrus has a group, Lance Air has a group, Cessna has a group. We need to think about how to get into those groups to take advantage of the enthusiasm of these groups as well as the interest of these groups after an accident. Just a couple of comments with regard to the particular accidents chosen. I was going to ask Mr. Shaver, you investigated the accident with the PA-24, was it 24 or 12? The loss of power, well, it was the engine failure on takeoff. It's been a long-standing argument about can you turn back to the field or not? When can you turn back to the field? How many successful turnbacks are you aware of?
When there's a total loss of engine power, I'm personally not aware of any. And I'm aware and knowledge, and I know of the research of the possible impossible turn. But my opinion is that in all practicality, there really it doesn't do justice to safety.
So teaching pilots to basically, on engine failure on takeoff, pretty much go straight ahead, and as Bob Hoover said, fly the airplane all the way to the crash.
Absolutely. And another thing that it does, is it gives pilots more things to think about. And in an emergency situation, cognitively, there are really only a few things that your mind can go with, in that kind of situation. If you already have those things worked out prior to takeoff, by briefing and telling yourself what you're going to do beforehand, that makes it that much easier, and it takes that much more out of your brain when something does happen.
Good, thank you.
Member Rosekind.
I just want to start by echoing the chairman and just acknowledge that I think it's great we're having this board meeting. It's great to see all of you here and giving visibility to this issue, and just thank you for all these efforts because you're doing so much of this every year. So my question actually is, each one of you, I'm curious, including Ms. Gagne, sort of all 4 of you, give one example of some of the outreach that you've already done, not necessarily around stall per se, but there's a lot of talk, a great job with the alerts, and clearly the next step is how to get them out there, which has been the focus of some of the other comments. If each of you just give an example of some outreach you've already done to give us some sense of where you think those touch points are that we could really make a difference with these.
Okay, we'll just go down the line. We near where I live, there's a local Part 61 flight school with a very strong safety culture, and they like to have me come and talk to their ground schools and bring accidents to see them every year. And one year I went, and I had one of their students come up to me who had come to my presentation the year before, and she told me that she had gotten into a situation, she's a student pilot in a Cessna 152, and got into some shower activity and reducing visibility that really scared her. And she told me that she remembered me presenting one of our VFR and IMC accidents in which the pilot just kept going and would not tell the air traffic controller needed help, and it ended very badly. And she said she remembered me saying, stay calm, fly the plane, ask for help. And all she wanted to talk about is how she sung to keep herself calm and how nice the air traffic controller was. But to just hear that an outreach at a flight school made a difference to just one person is pretty rewarding.
General aviation in Alaska is the lifeblood, of everything there, especially once you get outside of the cities. And one of the things that we take pride in with our outreach, and as Member Weiner touched upon, was the Medallion Foundation and their circle of safety and the efforts that they take on to help GA pilots. And one of our recent initiatives was to help them and to go out and advocate for some of the things that they're doing, especially GA simulators, general aviation flight simulators, which they offer a number of them throughout the state now, free of charge to any certificated pilot. And we're really hoping that that's going to reach its full potential as we start getting the word out about that even more.
So last spring, I worked with the AOPA Air Safety Foundation and hit several different seminars with pilots where we were able to present to 500 pilots at a time and sing to them our message and the importance of aviation safety. In addition, on an annual basis, I go and present at Flying After Hours on the West Slope there in Colorado and bring an important safety message to that group of approximately 100 pilots, whether it be weather-related, density altitude related, loss of control related, or maintenance related.
Thank you, sir. I've done several of the fasting briefings, and specifically, actually, last year I was involved in the IA seminar put on by one of the local businesses that does recurrent training for the A&P mechanics, and I got to do a presentation there for it was probably at least 200 mechanics.
Those are all great examples, and I think Ms. Gagne, your example in particular shows it's so hard to measure your effect. You get in front of Ms. Road 500 people. You don't know, every one of them takes a message away and some lesson learned, and you may never know which life got saved unless you have a chance to go back and they get to tell you the story. And so those are all great examples, and I hope we capitalize on every one of those and think about even more. Thanks.
Vice Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like to join in on thanking you for pursuing this topic and thank Member Weiner for putting us down this road, because I take this up close and personal as a GA pilot myself. I had the advantage, though, of with an aeronautical engineering degree, I had intense understanding of the fact that you can stall at any attitude, any airspeed, any power, so I really understood that, but I certainly ran into a lot of pilots in my day who didn't. In fact, I had an instructor one time who was checking me out in an airplane, and when we were doing an obstacle clearance takeoff, he said the best way to do that is to climb out with a stall alert bleeping, because the slower you go, the faster you can climb. I didn't go back to that instructor, needless to say, but the point is there is a tremendous lack of understanding of stall and spin characteristics, and of course there was the heated debate over the years of how should we do stall training, should we do spin training, and this, that, and the other. I just wonder, is there any correlation between the way we've trained for stalls and spins and the number of stall and spin accidents that we've had? I mean, I know that heated debate about spin training, because they were losing so many people in the training, they said, oops, don't want to do that. But then I wonder, and that was part of the heated debate. When they stopped that, did that mean there were more spin accidents because people just actually have never seen it? There's no way you didn't have any simulators. You couldn't do it in a simulator. There's no way to see it except in a real airplane. But doing it in a real airplane, especially a twin, was very, very dangerous just from instructional experience. So I'm just wondering, looking at the big picture over the years, is there any correlation with changes in training techniques with the accident record? Is that a fair question, or do we even have data that would be sufficient to address a question like that?
We'll certainly look down the line and see if anybody has a feel for the type of statistics that you're talking about, whether we have a feel for that. But I just wanted to add a personal story. Like yourself, I'm an aeronautical engineer, and when I became a private pilot, it was in the day where no longer were you required to experience a spin in your private pilot training. So certainly many stalls and recoveries from stalls. It was great to feel those things that I had read and learned about. Shortly after I became a private pilot, I did an hour of aerobatic training, and it was my first opportunity to experience a spin. After everything that I knew about it, after demonstrating my competence at the private pilot level, I was completely disoriented by actually experiencing a spin. I was not prepared for how tight my shoulder straps were going to feel as the airplane nosed so far down to the ground that I felt my body leaning that far forward. And the instinct at that moment is certainly not to lower the nose to get out of the spin. And so personally, when I talk to new private pilots, I realize it's not required for them to have that experience, but I ask and encourage and plead with them to spend the time and the money to go up for an hour of aerobatic training and feel a spin before you ever get one in anger. Anyone else with thoughts about the statistics?
I think that's a point very well taken. I too did the aerobatic training and did the spin, and whoa, I went through that whole thing too. And the nose down attitude. I mean, you can read about it till you're blue in the face, but to actually see that nose down attitude and the ground is in your face, I mean, that's a scary experience. So I'm not expressing an opinion one way or another because I don't have an opinion. I don't know enough about it to know. But I just wonder if when we eliminated that kind of training and made it not possible for people to see that until they actually experience themselves, probably without an instructor, have we gone in the right direction?
I think that it's of vast importance to learn how to recover from these situations, stalls and spins. But the move toward stall prevention, stall spin prevention, I think has been key. And I don't know the statistics that go along to match it, but anecdotally, most of these accidents occur at such a low altitude that recovery really isn't going to be an option. So I think the move toward prevention is key. But I do also think, as John was saying, aerobatic training and upset recovery training can really help a pilot get to that while also learning the recovery. It helps them learn to recognize the initial onset.
I'd like to add just one other thought on that. One of the things we see is that this is not necessarily unique to a new pilot. In my particular case, or the case that I have in front of you, it was a 100-hour total pilot. Jennifer's case was an 18,000-hour pilot. So it covers the entire spectrum of experience for pilots. This is not necessarily just a brand new pilot that has these accidents.
Okay, thank you very much.
I think we started talking about this accident rate and what a challenge it is compared to others that we've seen in the commercial side. And I think that we're really looking at different types of flying and different types of exposure, and I think trying to understand why these things happen and how we get those messages out and how we connect with people is important. You all talked about your experience, and I know that you all have a lot of different types of experience, but I actually wanted to ask my first question to my fellow board member, Member Sumwalt, who spent a career as a commercial pilot. And so, Member Sumwalt, they talked about a number of scenarios to be prepared for an engine-out type of situation. And you flew in multi-engine aircraft as a commercial pilot, and you also had training, and I wonder if you could tell me about your training and also about the experience that you had as a commercial pilot, how often you actually had an in-flight experience with an engine out.
Well, thank you. And, I flew for 32 years, and I guess somewhere in there I accumulated about 14,000 hours. And the reality is I never had an engine failure during that entire period of time. There was once where I had to shut down an engine because of a fire warning, and I was a brand new captain then, but it was a non-event because because of the training that I had. And furthermore, I believe in what Mr. Shaver was talking about, and that is going ahead and mentally rehearsing these emergencies before you experience them. And I call it putting it into your mental RAM. You know, if you have to retrieve information quickly, would you rather have to go way down to that mental hard drive of yours and look for something, or would you rather have it right there? And so in the case of the engine shutdown, the engine fire we had shortly after takeoff, and I would have a lengthy drive to work on interstate highways, and I would sort of think about, what am I going to do if I have an engine failure or an engine fire? And so when we had this fire warning, it was just simply a matter of recalling what I'd practiced in the car 2 hours earlier. And I cannot overestimate or cannot overemphasize the importance of that mental rehearsal, of putting something into that mental RAM before you have to execute it. I flew gliders, and in a glider, in fact, if the tow plane, if something happens, then you don't have a choice. You do, if you're below 200 feet, you do turn back to the airport, which is different than airplanes. But I knew I was not going to have time to think about that if it happened. So before every takeoff in the glider, I would mentally go through the rope brake procedure. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lower the nose to keep my airspeed. Then I'm going to turn into the wind, and the wind is coming from this direction. So I'm going to make and these bank angles sound extreme for airplane operators at 150 feet above ground, but you had to do it in a glider. Push the nose down. I'm going to roll it into the wind, 45 degrees of bank, and I'm going to come back around, and I'm going to land at this field. But I had to load it into my mental RAM, and I just cannot overemphasize the importance of doing that, mentally rehearsing things before you encounter them.
So as a commercial pilot, though, you had training every 6 months in a simulator for potential engine out situations, and you had multiple crew members in the cockpit with you, and you usually had multi-engine aircraft, correct?
That's exactly right.
So now we turn to our team, and I know you all have a lot of general aviation experience, and I actually know I've talked to some of you all about some in-flight emergencies that you've had, multiple emergencies over your careers. And I don't think you all have flown as long as member Sumwalt, but could you tell me about if you've experienced an engine failure or an emergency like you've just talked about that you want people to think about?
I can speak from personal experience after having flown for 19 years. When I was a brand new flight instructor about 18 years ago, I was out in the practice area with a student pilot, and we were practicing ground reference maneuvers. And on the completion of our flight lesson, we headed back to the airport, at which time we experienced a very loud bang and a partial loss of engine power. And we were less than 1,000 feet above the ground. We did not have the power to make it back to the airport. And the flight training that I had gone through, the preparation that we had gone through prior to the flight, it, as Mr. Shaver stated, as Member Sumwalt stated, it becomes autopilot because you rehearse these scenarios before every takeoff. You rehearse these scenarios every day while you're quote unquote flying your couch. And so autopilot kicked in. We assessed the situation. We established that we were not going to have enough engine power to make it back to the airport. We selected a forced landing location, and I will say that in the 19 years of flying, it was the best landing that I've ever had. Uneventful, no injuries, no damage, but it was that continued exposure to emergency procedures, that continued training that didn't stop when I became a flight instructor. It continued every single day as I was a flight instructor, and something that I impressed on my students is you always have to be prepared for the absolute worst and always have to be prepared for a forced landing. So wherever you are, you're always looking for when you're going to have to put the airplane down, fly the airplane, aviate, navigate, and then communicate.
Mr. Hatch, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I have to say I've been fortunate that I haven't lost an engine on takeoff. But as has been pointed out before, that it goes through my mind on every takeoff that what if, where am I going to go if this thing quits right now? And so I have that option available to me, and I don't have to go through a delay in deciding what I'm going to do. I've already made the decision of what I'm going to do and where I'm going to put that aircraft on takeoff.
Mr. Shaver, did you want to comment?
Sure. Spent most of my career flying in corporate aviation. And I had one of the unfortunate experiences of having an engine failure, and with the ones that most people also train mostly for, but also fear, is the engine failure right after V1 speed on takeoff. Ours happened to happen because of a bird strike, or bird ingestion in the engine. But what I can take from that was, when that instance happened, there was an absolute overwhelming urge from just instinctually to want to remain on the runway, to want to stay there, be on the runway, because that's safety. And if it weren't for training, and if it weren't for that briefing of takeoff saying, you know what, if after V1 something happens, we're flying. We're not gonna stop. I can tell you that if we would have relied on instinct in that situation, we would have been in an accident. We would have been off the runway, and that speaks volumes just toward training and briefing a takeoff. Just something as simple as that.
So I think, in summary, with this panel, events do happen, and I think that's the thing, is these aren't accidents. These are events that occur. There's reasons why they occur, whether it's a bird strike or a fire, or a loss of engine power. Things happen, and you have to be prepared for them. And I think you've explained to us today. We've got 2 out of 3 of our presenters here who have experienced an event themselves. And so pilots in general aviation in particular, they don't have every 6 months to get to go in the simulator, Mr. Shaver, and experience that. They don't necessarily have someone that's sitting next to them that they have to give that pre-takeoff briefing to about what's going to happen if this, what's going to happen if that. And so in many ways, they're an airline of one. They have to have that discipline and that thoughtfulness every time that they get in the airplane to think about what could happen and to do that mental brief or that mental checklist. And so we want to make sure that we're investigating the events, Mr. Shaver, that you said only involve bent metal, because things will happen, but it's about getting people down safely. So you were asked the question earlier about the successful turnbacks, and I thought we really don't investigate the successful things, and so that's a tough question for us in any situation for us to answer. We only investigate the things that don't work out, and I think your presentations here help to illuminate these issues in a very professional way, but also in a personal way, because you're pilots yourselves, and it's that personal knowledge that I think helps inform the work that you do. Thank you so much for your service, and thank you for your presentation. We look forward to hearing the next one. I know you might need a minute to switch the tables.
We do, just a brief seat and change. Our next draft safety alert, reduced visual references require vigilance, addresses the problem of fatal accidents that occur in reduced visibility weather conditions. Historically, about 2/3 of all GA accidents that occur in such weather conditions are fatal. These accidents typically involve pilot spatial disorientation or controlled flight into terrain. Mr. Chris Shaver will present the first accident scenario.
Thank you. Shortly into a VFR cross-country flight, an Aero Commander 680FL airplane collided with mountainous terrain and daylight instrument meteorological conditions about 7 miles north of Paris, California. The airline transport pilot was killed, and the airplane was substantially damaged. The flight was being operated under provisions of Part 91 with no flight plan filed. The flight was the pilot's second attempt at returning the airplane to its home base, after the first attempt required a weather diversion to Palm Springs the previous day. The pilot had accumulated more than 33,000 flight hours, held an airline transport pilot certificate with multiple type ratings, was instrument current, and had recent experience in the accident airplane. There was no record that the pilot obtained an official weather briefing prior to the flight, though he did tell a customer service agent at the fixed base operator, or FBO, to hold a rental car for him in case he needed to return to the airport because of weather. About the time of departure, the Palm Springs airport was reporting VFR conditions. Weather stations along the pilot's initial intended flight route were reporting marginal VFR conditions with ceilings that varied between 1,500 and 2,500 feet above ground level. NEXRAD weather radar images showed that an area of concentrated precipitation surrounded the area of the accident site at the time of the accident. GPS data recovered from a portable receiver on board the airplane provided information about the flight path. This map shows the accident airplane's flight path in red, and surface roadways are shown in yellow. The airplane departed from Palm Springs and headed west along a highway corridor through a mountain valley pass. For the majority of the flight, the airplane maintained altitudes that kept it about 900 to 1,200 feet above the valley floor, but below the peaks that surrounded the highway corridor. About 3 minutes before the airplane collided with terrain, the airplane's flight track turned to the southwest, away from a concentrated area of precipitation, but directly towards a small, isolated mountain with a 2,700-foot peak that rose 1,000 feet above the surrounding terrain. This map shows the airplane's flight path during the final minutes of the accident flight, beginning in the upper right corner of the map. About 1 minute before the airplane impacted terrain, the pilot reported to an air traffic controller that he was having difficulty maintaining VFR, and he asked for an IFR clearance. The airplane was already in close proximity to the train at this time, and no further communication was received from the pilot. The airplane impacted terrain near the crest of the mountain peak. This photograph shows the airplane's wreckage debris field near the summit of the mountain. The NTSB determined that the probable cause of this accident was the pilot's decision to continue visual flight into instrument meteorological conditions, which resulted in an in-flight collision with mountainous terrain. In looking at this accident, there are a number of missed opportunities that could have changed the outcome of this flight. There was no record that the pilot obtained an official weather briefing. However, he appeared to have at least some awareness of the possibility of adverse weather along his flight route, as evidenced by his request that a rental car be held for him in case he needed to return because of weather. Although the pilot's request to hold the rental car shows he did plan ahead with a flight cancellation alternative, it's interesting to note that he decided first to attempt the flight rather than cancel it before using that alternative. There were external pressures on the pilot to complete the flight because the airplane needed to be returned to its home base. However, it is not known why he was motivated to complete the flight that day. And although the pilot asked to pick up an IFR clearance in flight, he had allowed the situation to become dangerous before he made that decision to act. By the time that he made his request, it was too late. He had already encountered the adverse weather, and the terrain collision was imminent. When we look at the lessons that can be taken from this accident, it really all comes down to decision making. More so, it's about making the right decisions at the right time. And if there's any doubt about the weather, and if you can accomplish a flight VFR, that should immediately trigger something in your mind to reevaluate the situation, your competencies, and the airplanes, and either cancel the flight or make the flight under instrument flight rules. Taking off into marginal weather to quote-unquote take a look should never be an option. When things start to go wrong, as in this case, you've already passed the right time to make a good decision. And it is important to remember that you never have to be anywhere when flying an airplane. The next speaker will be Mr. Dennis Diaz.
Good morning. In July 2011, a Cessna 182S impacted trees and terrain during a flight that was conducted in dark night visual meteorological conditions. The certificated, instrument-rated private pilot and the passenger were returning home from a vehicle auction and were both fatally injured. Shortly after departing on the accident flight, the pilot requested VFR flight following services from air traffic control and stated that his destination was Columbus, Georgia. About 25 minutes after departing, radio contact with the pilot was lost after air traffic control issued the pilot a frequency change. GPS data recovered from a portable receiver provided information about the flight. This map shows the airplane's flight path in red. The airplane departed from Meridian, Mississippi, and shortly thereafter, radio contact was lost here. Upon reaching Columbus, Georgia, the airplane turned northeast toward Irwin, North Carolina. Sunset and the end of civil twilight occurred nearly 1 hour before the airplane reached Irwin, near this point. The moon did not rise until about 1 hour after the accident. A witness who landed at Irwin about 1 hour after the accident reported that the area to the southwest of the runway was a black hole due to the lack of ground lighting and stated that flying in the area could be very disorienting. This map shows the airplane's flight track as it approached Irwin. The airplane initially intercepted and tracked down the final approach course to runway 5. The airplane then began maneuvering in the vicinity of the runway, turning southeast, back northwest, and again southeast, while climbing and descending to altitudes that varied between 1,300 and 2,500 feet. The airplane crossed the final approach course for the final time at an altitude of 2,000 feet. This graphic shows the airplane's flight path during the final seconds of the flight, beginning at the top of the map. After crossing the final approach path to runway 5 for the final time, the airplane entered a descending right turn. The radar observed descent rate during that turn exceeded 4,800 feet per minute, as the airplane descended from an altitude of 2,000 feet. The airplane subsequently impacted trees and terrain in a right bank, about 1/2 mile from the runway threshold. The main wreckage came to rest partially submerged in the Cape Fear River about 700 feet beyond the initial impact point. This photograph shows the wreckage of the airplane as viewed from the south bank of the river. And this photograph shows a portion of the wreckage after it was recovered to the shore of the river. A review of the 79-year-old pilot's flight logs showed that he had not logged any flights within the 8 months preceding the accident flight. The logs also showed that the pilot's most recent flight review was completed nearly 5 years before the accident flight. While the pilot did hold an instrument rating, there were no records of the pilot having completed an instrument proficiency check. The log also showed that the pilot had only 0.2 of an hour of flight experience at night within the preceding year. The NTSB determined that the probable cause of the accident was the pilot's loss of control due to spatial disorientation while maneuvering in dark night conditions. The investigation also discovered that the airplane's audio system was configured in a way that would not have allowed the pilot to contact air traffic control facilities or activate the pilot-controlled lighting at Irwin Airport, as can be seen in this photograph. If the pilot had inadvertently configured the system in this way, it might account for his loss of communications earlier in the flight and for his maneuvering in the vicinity of the airport as he attempted to activate the pilot-controlled lighting there in vain. In looking at this accident, there are a number of opportunities where the pilot could have changed the outcome of the flight. First, It is possible that the pilot may not have fully understood how to operate all of the onboard systems, including the audio panel. While this may seem innocuous on the surface, as this accident has evidenced, when compounded with other decisions, resulted in a tragic outcome. After encountering communication abnormalities, the pilot could have diverted the flight to a nearby airport, or could have landed at one of the many airports he overflew en route to Irwin. The pilot also could have terminated the flight prior to nightfall in order to troubleshoot the problem on the ground, possibly with the help of another pilot or a mechanic. Upon reaching the destination and not being able to activate the airport's pilot-controlled lighting, the pilot could have diverted to another airport where continuous night lighting was provided and where such a disorienting, non-groundlit area was not present. As a pilot and flight instructor, I can appreciate the challenges pilots face in managing the risks associated with each flight and balancing those risks with the practical considerations of trying to make it to a business meeting, return home to family, or when just flying for the fun of it. As an air safety investigator, I have the unique opportunity to see firsthand what happens when pilots are unsuccessful in managing those risks. When an accident occurs in reduced visibility conditions, the results are often fatal, which when juxtaposed against how easily preventable these accidents are, makes them particularly tragic. Additionally, no pilot is immune to the dangers of flying in reduced visibility conditions. These accidents have taken the lives of countless student, instrument-rated, and even airline transport pilots, their friends, and family. I truly believe that by following the suggestions provided in the safety alerts we are discussing today, every pilot can take one step towards making their flights safer and reduce the likelihood that they or their families will ever have to meet me in a professional capacity. Mr. Elliott Simpson will now present a spatial disorientation accident.
Good morning. About noon on April 7th, 2008, an experimental amateur-built Vans RV-10 was destroyed when it impacted trees and terrain in Seal, Alabama during an instrument approach into Columbus Metropolitan Airport in Georgia. The airplane departed Lebanon, Tennessee about 2 hours prior with an intended destination of Eufaula, Alabama. The private pilot and pilot-rated passenger builder sustained fatal injuries. This was one of the first RV-10 kit airplanes to be completed, and it was equipped with glass cockpit primary and backup flight instruments. The flight was intended to be a cross-country trip to Sun and Fun, with Eufaula as a first stop. The approach portion was flown in daylight IMC, and an IFR flight plan had been filed. The pilot had accrued a total of about 1,700 flight hours. He was instrument current, and about 1/4 of his flight time was in actual IMC conditions. However, the majority of his prior IFR experience was in his personal airplane, a Cessna Cardinal, which was equipped with conventional instruments. He did not have prior flight experience in the accident airplane or type. The passenger was a private pilot with no instrument rating. He'd accumulated about 70 hours of flight time in the airplane. He was the co-builder, and he appeared well versed in the airplane's operation. Now, for the first 2 hours of flight, VMC conditions prevailed. While the arrival area was VMC with visibilities of about 8 miles, 1,000-foot ceilings, and 4,500-foot cloud tops, the approach required a descent into IMC conditions. Here we can see the airplane's GPS flight track in red, indicating the entire 300-mile-long flight. The data indicated that the autopilot was most likely engaged during this initial cruise segment. The approach descent into IMC occurred about 25 minutes prior to the accident, as can be indicated by the orange bracket. In this image, we can see the flight track for the final 20 minutes of flight, covering about a 30-mile radius. The green dotted line indicates the radial for the Eufaula VOR runway 18 instrument approach, and as can be seen by the track data, the pilot was clearly experiencing difficulty maintaining a stabilized approach. He ultimately requested vectors to Auburn, but while en route, he requested a diversion to an airport with an ILS approach. He was subsequently cleared for the Columbus ILS-6, the localizer of which is indicated in blue. Again, he appeared to experience difficulty executing the approach with the ultimate wreckage location indicated by the white circle. This flight track of the last 3 minutes of flight paints a fairly graphic picture of the airplane's final moments. The last turn was consistent with a hook maneuver, which we often observe during the final stages of a spatial disorientation accident. On multiple occasions throughout the last 14 minutes of flight, the airplane deviated approximately 400 feet above and 1,200 feet below its assigned altitude. The controller twice relayed low-altitude alert warnings and on 5 occasions alerted the pilot that he was not maintaining the assigned headings. The debris path was about 440 feet long, and the airplane was heavily fragmented. The NTSB determined the probable cause as the pilot's loss of airplane control due to spatial disorientation. One of the contributing factors was also his lack of flight experience in the accident airplane. Missed opportunities. The pilot did not declare an emergency at any point during the flight. Air traffic control personnel did provide the required assistance. However, the pilot's declaration of an emergency would have provided them further cues as to his plight and prompted additional resources to become available. Additionally, the pilot did not initiate a climb into VMC, even though the cloud tops were relatively low. And as mentioned, the pilot had no documented glass cockpit or type experience. In my experience, the pilot had an unusually high number of actual IMC flight time for a general aviation pilot. Conversely, although the pilot-rated passenger had extensive knowledge of the airplane, he would not have been familiar with flying an instrument approach. As such, the cross-pollination of pilot and passenger experience meant that while the flight was perfectly legal, embarking on it was not necessarily advisable. In the last 4 years, I've investigated 9 fatal accidents where spatial disorientation was causal. 4 of these involved airplanes equipped with glass cockpits. When transitioning into a glass cockpit, training is crucial. Don't assume that if you can use an iPad, you can easily operate a glass panel. In fact, a recent NTSB study concluded that training in conventional cockpits does not prepare pilots for safe operation of the many complex and varied glass cockpit systems available. In conclusion, it's easy with hindsight to pass judgment on the mistakes of other pilots. However, although they probably wouldn't like to admit it, many of my fellow investigators have themselves at one time or another come close to being a statistic in the NTSB database. I, for one, would not be alive if it wasn't for the valuable lessons I learned early in my flying career after reading and learning from the NTSB report of one particular high-profile spatial disorientation accident. So even though today we'll be discussing the many practical ways pilots can mitigate risk, I would urge at minimum that pilots simply make a habit of reading and learning from the mistakes of others.
The 3 accidents that staff just presented are summarized in the draft safety alert. Reduced visual references require vigilance. The safety alert also provides links to educational resources, and it offers pilots the following advice.
Obtain an official pre-flight weather briefing and use all appropriate sources of weather information to make timely in-flight decisions. Do not allow a situation to become dangerous before deciding to act. Be honest with air traffic controllers about your situation and ask for help if you need it.
Remember that when flying at night, even visual weather conditions can be challenging. When planning a night VFR flight, use topographic references to familiarize yourself with the surrounding terrain. Consider following instrument procedures if you are instrument rated, or avoiding areas with limited ground lighting if you are not. Be honest with yourself about your skill limitations. Plan ahead with cancellation or diversion alternatives, and brief passengers about those alternatives before the flight.
Seek training to ensure that you are proficient and fully understand the features and limitations of the equipment in your aircraft, particularly the avionics, autopilot systems, and weather information equipment. Manage distractions. Many accidents result when a pilot is distracted momentarily from the primary task of flying. This concludes the staff presentations on this safety alert topic. We're prepared to answer your questions at this time.
Thank you for your excellent presentations, Member Sumwalt.
Yes, as I'm sitting here listening, and the chairman's already said this, this is fascinating because you guys, you're sitting here with your coats and ties on and dress, but you folks are the ones that are out there investigating these accidents, and it's amazing, like when Elliot Simpson said, you know, I've investigated 9 accidents like this or something. I mean, this is a real telling story here, and so I think that the safety alerts themselves have learning value, but I think that this board meeting has tremendous learning value as well. And so, Mr. DeLisi, has there been any consideration for, I know these board meetings stay on the website for only 90 days. I'd like to see if we could perpetuate that so that if somebody like AOPA, Air Safety Institute, or GAMA, or NBAA, or if anybody would like these board meetings, it'd be great for this particular board meeting. It'd be good for learning value. What are we planning in that area, if anything?
Great. Certainly to go along with these safety alerts, we're preparing videos, and they're scripted stories from each of our investigators that'll be intermixed with accident site footage and perhaps even some excerpts of today's meeting. So I think that'll be our best vehicle, those packaged videos. I think they would make a great resource on a rainy day for a flight instructor to sit down with a student and spend a few minutes watching some videos.
Absolutely. That will be fascinating. Thank you.
Member Weiner.
Spatial disorientation, of course, has been around for a long time. It's been a problem in the, particularly in the lesser experienced pilots, although some of the pilots that used in the examples here were not inexperienced by any means. I think AOPA has a statistic for the life expectancy of a pilot after inadvertent flight from VFR into IMC. And I believe that number is like 140-some seconds from the time he enters to the time he crashes, which is not very long. Part of that perhaps is just the inability to fly the airplane. Part of it is perhaps due to suddenly a very high workload and the pilot not being able to manage the workload as a single pilot. Last week I had the opportunity to go to the NATCA, the National Air Traffic Controllers Association conference in Las Vegas, and give a keynote speech there, but also participate in a breakout session where we talked about pilots, GA pilots in particular. I also had a chance to attend their annual banquet, for which the real focus was the awards given to controllers for saves. And what really struck me was the number of times controllers do, in fact, provide the save in particular in situations like this where a little bit of help goes a long ways. We like to teach single pilot resource management and suggest that pilots get all of the resource support that they can. The controllers provide a real good source of information, source of support. In some cases, the Archie League Awards indicated controller in one particular case basically spent their time trying to calm the pilot, and something as simple as that was successful. What also struck me was many pilots are afraid to declare an emergency and get ATC's help because of a concern about, well, they'll be violated, or they're going to end up having to file some paperwork, or they're going to get a talking to. Of course, getting a talking to is highly advisable in place of crashing an airplane. But what really struck me was none of these pilots that were involved in these controller saves apparently in any way found themselves in trouble. They, much the opposite. The controller was delighted to have accomplished a save, and the satisfaction from making that save eliminated any thought of trying to violate a pilot. So I think it's an important point to make that in a spatial disorientation, or in a situation where the workload goes high, the ability to fly the airplane has to become primary. There's lots of help available.
Member Roskine.
I just first going to comment, I think I love the way the safety alerts are structured with the accidents and then action-oriented things that pilots can actually do. And all of you have a lot of professional and personal experience. I noticed, Mr. Simpson, when you made a comment referencing NTSB air safety investigators possibly being in the NTSB database, I think I detected a smirk on Ms. Gagne's face. I don't know if she's got the data handy, but I'm not going to ask about that. What I am curious, both the professional and personal experiences, at least in this arena, visual references, do each of you have a favorite, as far as the action things from your experience of what you've investigated, flying personally? We have 8 things we've identified that are in there, nicely coordinated the way you read them and stuff, et cetera. But, if we can go down the line, again, I'm curious, what's the take-home message? Each of you probably have a favorite from some personal experience or professional. Give it to us now.
I guess one thing that has struck me a lot in these spatial disorientation, VFR, and IMC accidents is that it always seemed to me out on scene, they always had friends and family on board. And I always wondered if the reluctance to ask the controller for help had something to do with the passengers being on board, whether they didn't want to alarm them by, having everybody else hear on the headset, hey, I've got a problem, I need some help, or it was a pride thing that they didn't want their buddies to, know that the guy flying the plane or gal flying the plane is really in a situation here. But it always seemed inevitable to me that if I was going out to a weather accident, it was 3 or 4 people on board.
I think that my take home, this kind of goes along with the last bullet of my presentation, is just pushing the fact that you really never have to be anywhere. You can stay on the ground. You have that choice. And going out and taking a look or pushing things into weather that might be beyond your capabilities, it really shouldn't even go into the equation, and that's what I've always tried to stress as an instructor and as a pilot, is that, I'd much rather be sitting here on the ground, wishing that I was flying, than be the other way around.
Great.
I think for me and the accident I presented in particular, the aspects of flying at night, and that the idea that even though you could be flying in what's reported as VMC, but to get up there and to even take off from an airport and then just make a turn out over an area that has very little ground lighting, and all of a sudden it may as well be IMC because there's no perceptible horizon, and there's always that academic, okay, I know that, but then when you get out there and experience it, it's a whole different ball game. And so personally, having had instrument training already to fall back on, it wasn't a dangerous situation, but it was very surprising and very eye-opening. And being a pilot that might not have that experience to fall back on, I can definitely see that could be very dangerous. And so I guess that's my what I would hope someone would take away, if anything, is that night is a unique environment and it's very challenging. It presents unique challenges, and appreciate that before you make that flight.
I see in a presentation here there's a link that says links to educational resources. As I alluded to in my presentation, I really encourage pilots to read our NTSB reports as thoroughly as possible. Again, as I mentioned, there's no question that I'm alive because of a pretty high-profile accident. It was actually the John F. Kennedy accident. It's happened a few years after I learned to fly. And I had myself set up in almost exactly the same situation as him. Family on board, same part of the world. My Cessna 172, relatively low time private pilot, heading towards dusk. Same part of the world. I was flying towards the Catskills from Binghamton, New York to Danbury. And technically a VFR day. As I approached the Catskills, I was ready to just proceed. But in the back of my mind, that John F. Kennedy accident kept coming back. I turned around and landed. And ultimately, the plane had to stay there for a week because the weather really came in bad. But it's something that really did touch me, and it's something that we see a lot from pilots who we speak to. Whenever they find out whether they're NTSB investigators, the first thing they say is, "Oh, I love your reports. I read them thoroughly. I read them all the time." And that to me is one of the biggest take-homes. We could come up with specific things to avoid, but I feel like just educating yourself on accident investigation in general would be certainly something to take home.
I got to tell you, just listening to you and the last group, you know, there's just not just professional, but a lot of personal experience here, which translates into wisdom. So as far as the outreach goes, you can give them reports, you can give them alerts, but I think the interaction of being able to tell your stories is a whole nother level of what's going to help these things actually get changed. And I'm going to hope that Mr. DeLisi, that they're not just watching videos when it's raining out, but the kind of tools you're going to provide are things that people are going to get access to and use all the time, basically. Thanks.
Vice Chairman.
Thank you. I don't really have any questions, but I would just like to second the notion of figuring out a way to package this and get it out in the way that many organizations now do and put it on the internet and make it available for free. That's to me, that's huge in this instance, because none of these accidents we talked about involved any failure other than by the pilot. There was no equipment failure, no malfunction, anything. It was purely pilot decision making, and that's why I would certainly emphasize, you know, not only getting it out ourselves, but using those available avenues of those other organizations that already have widespread outreach mechanisms to reach a lot of people and make those interesting stories available to look at on a rainy day, to emphasize these are pilot issues. This isn't, you know, the engine failed. This isn't the gyro horizon failed. This is pilot issues, and I wholly endorse that notion. Thank you for a very good presentation.
A number of members have commented about how this is decision making, and when I look at these three accidents, you don't have brand new pilots and you don't have people who are young and inexperienced and hot dogging. Two of the pilots had about 2,000 hours, and one of the pilots, I think in the Palm Springs, had 33,000 hours. Is that correct? So these are pilots who have a lot of experience, and I noted that the ages of the pilots were 63, 65, and 79. And so I wonder if you all have any observations about experience and also about age.
I think a casual observation that could be not just spatial disorientation accidents, but any accident as an investigator. There's certainly many factors, you know, and you can't just single out age as one. But I certainly think that as experience gets greater, pilots have to be vigilant and guard against complacency. That, you know, inexperienced pilots who know they're inexperienced at least have that ability or have that forced upon them from their many influences. You know, stay vigilant and don't make these mistakes. But as you progress in your career, you know, you don't have those outside influences. So I think it has to come from within. That fortitude, that wherewithal to stay vigilant and not become complacent.
Anyone else? I noticed that one of our previous accidents had an 82-year-old pilot, and so I think one of the things that we all know is that the average age of general aviation pilots is going up. We don't have as many people entering for a number of different reasons, and so I think it is important for us to understand whether it's overconfidence or experience, but I think also understanding if there are medical conditions involved in some of these events is also important for us to take a look at. Some of these events, clearly here with the spatial disorientation and other things, they become very complex, and I think with the pilot that had, I think, Elliot, it was yours, that had so much time in IMC conditions and actually had another person with him to help. And so it's not that it's a single person that couldn't get help, and didn't have task overload. Something's going on there to have a pilot who's experienced. He was talking to air traffic control. He was looking for help. He was trying to get redirected somewhere else, that he knew he was in a condition that he needed assistance. How do we deal with those kinds of accidents and help people who have a lot of experience and actually are trying to troubleshoot? How do we address some of those? And I think obviously it's the decision making on the front end that gets you into some of these positions, but I think then once you're actually trying to get out, and I think you even saw a call for help on the Palm Springs event where he was asking for an IFR clearance, but it was too late. He's a minute away from the accident at that point, and so how do we get people to be? And I know we're going to have a session on risk assessment coming up, and so I think that I have some questions there, but I think we see in our experience that people are not always the best at evaluating risks. This is not just in general aviation. We see this in all modes of transportation, all the accidents we do. You guys have talked about distraction a couple of times. Again, we're not very good multitaskers, and we can't seem to crack some of these nuts that tend to be a little bit tougher. The equipment, we understand that. The experience or the currency, when we seem to have hard stops for things, we do pretty well. But when there's a lot of room, that's when sometimes the decision making tends to be problematic. And so we don't have a lot of laws for general aviation pilots to follow, particularly. And so I think it is interesting because when we look at the commercial side, and again, we compare the general aviation accident rate, the commercial accident rate, they have a lot of requirements and a lot of rules and a lot of expectations for a commercial pilot about minimums and decisions that they make. They have a book that tells them, don't do this that way. Here are the choices that you have to make. And you don't have a lot of discretion. These pilots have a lot of discretion, and I think that is trying to understand how we communicate about that. Everybody wants to get there, and I think this is that get there-itis. And I think a lot of times we're thinking these are young people who are willing to take risks. These are not young people. These are people who really understand they don't have to get there, right now. It's not that important. They have experience. They've probably seen a lot of friends who've been in accidents. How do we get through to these pilots? They probably think they're good pilots. So how do we get through to them? And Vice Chairman, Member Weiner has been working very hard with a lot of the external groups on GA safety, and our Office of Communications team has a plan in place. Each of these videos will be rolled out for each of these safety alerts, and I know some of those interviews have already taken place and are on film as we speak, and so we do have a plan, an advocacy plan that Member Weiner and our AS team have been working on, and I think they do understand how important it is to package these in lessons. We might not get people to watch a 3-hour board meeting, but we can certainly get them to watch a 3-minute video. So we're going to take a break. It's 11:04. We're going to take a 15-minute break until 11:20, and we'll come back and go through the remaining alerts. Welcome back. We'll now proceed with our third safety alert as your aircraft talking to you, and the risk management for mechanics together. Thanks. Kathy.
Our next two draft safety alerts is your aircraft talking to you, listen, and mechanics, manage risk to ensure safety, address accidents involving aircraft mechanical problems. Power plant system or component failure is the third most common defining event for fatal accidents in the personal flying sector of GA. Non-power plant system or component failure also ranks high on the list. The first safety alert, which is directed at pilots, discusses the importance of paying adequate attention to aircraft anomalies. The second safety alert, which is directed at mechanics, discusses maintenance mistakes that have led to in-flight emergencies and accidents. Mr. Joshua Cawthra will present the first accident scenario.
Good morning. Today I'm going to discuss an accident that involved an experimental, amateur-built, Vans RV-6 airplane that had impacted terrain near Paulden, Arizona. The flight originated from Sedona, Arizona, about 20 minutes prior to the accident. The 2,850-hour private pilot was fatally injured. According to a friend of the pilot, who was also the mechanic who performed the repairs on the airplane, the accident flight was supposed to be a maintenance test flight around the airport. About 6 weeks prior to the accident, the pilot was repositioning the airplane to his home in Texas. During a fuel stop in Sedona, he discovered an oil leak from the engine area. The mechanic that performed the repair work on the engine found that the stainless steel oil line from the propeller governor to the forward part of the crankcase exhibited an abrasion and a corresponding wear mark on the crankcase. The mechanic said the oil line was repaired by a local weld shop and subsequently reinstalled on the engine. An engine test run was conducted and no oil leaks were observed, and the engine cowling was reinstalled. The mechanic stated that the pilot wanted to fly the airplane and that they decided he would conduct a test flight and circle the airport for about 10 to 15 minutes prior to landing. Shortly after, the pilot taxied out, performed an engine run-up, and proceeded to take off. As the airplane lifted off of the runway, the mechanic observed a trail of white smoke originating from the airplane. Despite 2 requests by the mechanic to return to the airport, the pilot stated that everything was fine and that he was going to fly from Sedona to Paulden, a 37-mile flight. A witness located near the accident site and the pilot's intended destination reported observing the airplane flying over their location, performing turns to the left and right, while trailing white smoke. The witness stated that the airplane was about treetop level when it pitched down and impacted the ground. This photograph shows the airplane's wreckage in an open field near the pilot's intended destination. Oil was observed along the bottom side of the fuselage and tailwheel. The photograph on the left shows the oil line installed on the engine, while the photograph on the right shows the area of repairs that were performed to it. The NTSB determined the probable cause of this accident was the total loss of engine power due to oil starvation as a result of a leak from an inadequate repair weld repair of a high-pressure oil line. Also causal was the pilot's failure to maintain adequate airspeed while maneuvering that resulted in a stall during an attempted off-field landing and the pilot's decision to continue flight with a known discrepancy. Identifying a few missed opportunities when looking at this accident, the pilot deviated from the original plan to conduct a test flight and chose to conduct a cross-country flight, even after being notified of smoke trailing from his airplane during takeoff. It was not determined why the pilot diverted from the original plan. However, sticking to the original plan and terminating the flight immediately could have prevented this accident from occurring. Although this was an experimental amateur-built airplane, which are typically not required to comply with FAA airworthiness directives and manufacturer service bulletins, if the mechanic would have researched the publications for the engine, he would have found a service bulletin and FAA airworthiness directive were issued regarding the high-pressure oil line about 29 years prior to the accident. Both of these stated that if any leaks, chafing, or interference conditions existed, the oil line and attachment in fittings should be replaced with new parts. Being an accident investigator, I often see where simple items were missed during maintenance or decisions were made to continue a flight with a known discrepancy. Safety should take precedence over all other considerations. While it was not identified in this accident, one must resist the temptation to let any external pressures that may influence you to fly an aircraft that shows signs of a potential problem. Knowing your aircraft systems and being able to understand what your aircraft is telling you may help you identify a possible impending failure. If signs of a problem become evident during flight, the pilot should land as soon as practical and have the aircraft inspected. Sometimes this may even involve conducting an off-airport landing. The pilot should always know the purpose of the flight and stick to the plan, especially during a maintenance test flight. With preparation and planning, most accidents can be avoided. Pre-planning possible areas for off-airport landings in the event the engine loses power or a mechanical issue arises during the flight is highly suggested. Should an in-flight emergency occur, the pilot should have the ability to swiftly and successfully execute the emergency procedures and focus on flying the aircraft. This can mean the difference between life and death or serious injury. Take the opportunity to practice emergency procedures every chance you can help you make you be proficient and ready to handle the unexpected. Lastly, service bulletins and airworthiness directives exist for a reason. They often identify safety of flight issues and should not be taken lightly. This concludes my presentation, and the next speaker will be Mr. Michael Hune.
Thank you and good morning. I'm presenting this example case on behalf of Jose Obregon, who was the investigator in charge of this accident. The accident aircraft was a Beech 36 Bonanza, a single-engine airplane. The pilot owner had planned a personal out and back flight, a night instrument flight of about 230 miles each way. The engine experienced a complete loss of power on the return leg. The subsequent forced landing attempt was unsuccessful and the pilot was fatally injured. The pilot was the sole owner and operator of the airplane. He had about 2,300 hours of total flight experience. He held a flight instructor certificate with multi-engine and instrument ratings. The engine had been overhauled prior to the pilot's purchase of the airplane. At the time of the pilot's purchase, the engine had accumulated approximately 10 hours. Between the purchase and the accident, the pilot put about 50 more hours on the airplane. A mechanic on the pilot's airfield stated that several weeks before the accident, the pilot told him that he was having an engine oil pressure problem. The mechanic informed the pilot that he believed that the oil pressure problem was associated with the overhaul and recommended that the pilot have the engine thoroughly examined. About 1 week later, the pilot told the mechanic that the engine seemed okay. However, there was no evidence that any engine inspections, examinations, or corrective actions were accomplished subsequent to the overhaul or to the reported oil pressure problem. Regarding the accident flight itself, the pilot did not report any problems on the outbound leg of the flight. After refueling at the destination about midnight, the pilot taxied out for departure, but then returned to the FBO. He then requested a mechanic to address an unspecified problem and place the aircraft in a hangar. However, once he was advised that a mechanic would not be available until morning, the pilot changed his mind and departed for his home airport on the instrument flight. As I mentioned earlier, the engine experienced a complete power loss near the end of the return flight. The airplane struck a tree during the forced landing in night IMC. An examination of the engine revealed that there was a catastrophic failure of the crankshaft. The improper assembly of the engine during overhaul caused a main bearing in the engine case to fail, and that bearing failure resulted in the crankshaft failure. The NTSB determined that the probable cause of this accident was the pilot's continued operation of the aircraft with known deficiencies. Contributing to the accident was the improper assembly of the engine during overhaul. As we have been hearing throughout this meeting, some opportunities to avoid this accident were missed. We know that the engine exhibited an oil pressure problem well before the accident. However, contrary to actively addressing the oil pressure problem, the pilot continued to operate the airplane. The pilot did not take the most conservative course of action, which was grounding the airplane until the underlying problem was identified and resolved. Here are some additional lessons that can be gleaned from this accident. The pilot added to the risk level by operating a single-engine airplane with known engine problems in night IMC. The recency and extent of maintenance does not always ensure safety, and most failures provide warning indications. Those indications must not be downplayed or ignored. When a pilot is faced with warning indications and choices, the conservative approach can be inconvenient and/or costly, but it is always the safer approach. Unfortunately, the most conservative approach does not always appear to be the most desirable course of action, and some pilots make inappropriate choices. Aircraft pilots and owners should methodically consider possible options and outcomes and should strive to prevent outside factors from having an adverse safety impact on their decisions and conduct. It is my hope that the presentations and safety alerts that we are discussing here today will help some pilots avoid these inappropriate and hazardous choices. The next speaker will be Ms. Jennifer Rohde.
Thank you. Hello again. During a positioning flight, a Piper PA-23-250, commonly referred to as a Piper Aztec, impacted terrain 7.5 miles southwest of Sterling, Kansas. The airline transport pilot was killed, and the airplane was destroyed. The accident sequence initiated as both horizontal stabilators started to separate from the airplane. The maintenance records indicated that a 100-hour inspection had been completed 1 month prior to the accident. The last annual inspection had been completed 6 months prior to the accident. At the time of the accident, the airplane had an estimated 10,924 hours total time and had flown 73 hours since the last 100-hour inspection. The photograph on the left depicts the stabilator trim bell crank. The elongation in the hole seen here allowed for significant movement and slot between the stabilator trim bell crank and the bushing. The photograph on the right depicts the stabilator trim pushrod. This separated from the bell crank, and the nut and cotter pin used to secure the pushrod to the tab were missing. Maintenance records indicated that 6 years prior to the accident, the rod end and bolt had been replaced. These photographs depict the left and right stabilators, both of which separated from the airplane during the accident sequence. Significant aft streaking consistent with smoking or working rivets is present on the lower portion of both of these stabilators here, 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 and here. This photograph depicts the main wreckage. The NTSB determined that the probable cause of this accident was the loss of pitch control during cruise flight resulting from the separation of the stabilator trim actuator due to inadequate maintenance. This accident presents several different lessons that other mechanics can learn from to prevent future similar accidents. The aft streaking on the left and right stabilators was consistent with working rivets. There was significant free play in the stabilator trim bell crank. The lack of significant damage and the missing secure nut and cotter pin indicate that they had not been properly reinstalled during previous maintenance. All of these observations are indicative of an airplane that was not adequately maintained, creating a dangerous environment for the pilot. In the past 10 years, I have investigated multiple accidents where inadequate and improper maintenance have played a causal role in the accident. It is disheartening to continue to see the same mistakes over and over again. I view all of these accidents as preventable when maintenance professionals in the aviation industry accept their professional responsibility to ensure that the aircraft they are working on are in a clear airworthy state when they are returned to flight status. They can accomplish this by following the guidelines and regulations put forth by the FAA and the respective manufacturers. Mechanics should speak up when unsafe practices are observed or encouraged within their work environment. When a car is not properly maintained, the driver can pull over to the side of the road when problems or failures are encountered. When an airplane is not properly maintained, the pilot is not afforded the same option, and subsequent failures can be catastrophic, preventing the pilot from performing a successful forced landing. Neither pulling over to the side of the road nor performing a forced landing was an option for our accident pilot. The next speaker will be Mr. Josh Cothra.
Thank you. I will now discuss an accident that involved a Piper PA-46 310P airplane, commonly referred to as a Piper Malibu. The 850-hour private pilot sustained minor injuries, and the 5,735-hour flight instructor was seriously injured. The accident flight was the first flight following recent engine maintenance and the replacement of the number 4 and number 5 cylinders. The pilot reported that prior to the accident flight, both he and his flight instructor conducted a thorough pre-flight inspection on the airplane and found no mechanical issues, and subsequently departed on a cross-country flight. During the climb to cruise phase of the flight, as the airplane was climbing through about 16,000 feet MSL, the pilot heard a loud bang originate from the engine, followed by an immediate loss of engine power. He then diverted to a nearby airport and conducted an emergency descent checklist with no success in restarting the engine. During the forced landing, the airplane subsequently struck a fence and landed hard in an open field just short of the airport. This photograph shows the forward right side of the engine, including the induction elbow, directly above cylinder number 5, which was found displaced from the throttle and metering assembly tube. As shown in this photo, the clamp was found secure to the induction hose. However, the clamp and hose should have been installed farther to the right over the retention bead on the throttle and control assembly tube. The NTSB determined the probable cause of this accident was the loss of engine power due to the in-flight separation of the 1-3-5 cylinder induction tube elbow, which was caused by improper installation of the induction elbow or tube elbow by maintenance personnel. As previously mentioned, the cross-country accident flight was the first flight after maintenance was performed on the engine. Even though the pilot and flight instructor conducted an in-depth pre-flight inspection on the airplane, a local test flight prior to conducting a cross-country flight may have identified the problem sooner and while being in close proximity of the airport. Additionally, a service bulletin was issued by the engine manufacturer regarding the installation of the induction elbow clamps about 2 years prior to the accident, which compliance would have ultimately prevented the loss of power and the accident from occurring. Throughout my 10 years of investigating accidents, I have also seen numerous accidents stem from the improper and inadequate maintenance. It is good practice for the mechanics to pay attention to the manufacturer's specified instructions and review all items thoroughly before performing the work. In addition, mechanics should pay particular attention not only to the area where the task is being performed, but also to any surrounding components that may have been removed, disconnected, loosened to ease access during maintenance. Having another mechanic inspect your work is highly suggested and can ultimately help prevent maintenance-related accidents from occurring. Limiting workplace distractions, such as cellular phones or coworker conversations while performing critical work functions and inspections, is another highly recommended practice. It can be easy to become distracted and think the task was completed when it really was not finished. Pilots should be prepared and extra vigilant for problems during the first flight after maintenance. They should consider performing a test flight around the airport at a safe altitude following the maintenance before departing on a cross-country flight or taking passengers. In addition, these test flights should be planned accordingly, with possible landing areas predetermined in the event a mechanical failure occurs.
The 4 accidents that staff just presented are among those summarized in the 2 draft safety alerts. Is your aircraft talking to you? Listen, and mechanics manage risk to ensure safety. Each safety alert also provides links to educational resources, and they offer the following advice.
Remember, the purpose of the maintenance flight is to stick to the plan. Be prepared for problems and do not bring passengers. Listen to what your aircraft is telling you and act on it. Remember that shortcuts on the ground can cost you dearly in flight. Understand the maintenance troubleshooting takes time, and if any indication of potential problems persists after maintenance, additional maintenance or a second opinion may be in order. Remember that should an in-flight emergency occur, your ability to swiftly and successfully execute your aircraft's emergency procedures can mean the difference between life and death.
Remember that everybody makes mistakes, but that sound risk management practices can prevent errors. Carefully follow current manufacturer's instructions and ask for help if something is unfamiliar. Have another qualified person, other than the person who performed the maintenance, inspect critical items.
Be thorough when performing routine inspections. Do not defer items in need of immediate attention. Double-check the security of items that undergo maintenance and any surrounding components. Understand the hazards of fatigue and strive to eliminate fatigue contributions in your life. This concludes staff's presentation on these 2 safety alert topics, and we are prepared to answer your questions at this time.
Thank you for your sobering presentations. I think it gives all of us a lot to think about. Member Sumwalt.
Thank you. I was not planning on asking any questions or making any comments during this particular one, but something that Mr. Hune said got my attention about taking an airplane that was not, really should not have been flown. We've heard your perspective of what it's like to investigate an accident like that. I'll give you my perspective of somebody who was on the other end of it, who took an airplane that should not have been flown back when I was 22 years old. It had a twin-engine airplane, Aero Commander, nice airplane for a 22-year-old to be flying around in, but one of the magnetos was not checking out, and it was pretty darn rough. And in spite of that, I deliberately took the airplane. And I was wrong to do that, and I had forgotten about it until you mentioned that, and then I started getting sweat thinking about that, how stupid that was. And but since then, I did adopt something that I think has kept me out of a lot of trouble over the years, and that's exactly what you said. I still use this in my daily life. In fact, I think I even quoted it to the chairman a couple of weeks ago when we were discussing something, and that is, whenever I've got a decision to make, I try to err on the conservative side, and that's been the best advice that I have ever been given and followed for my entire flying career and in life in general. So anyway, just as somebody who's been there making stupid decisions, and I've made plenty of them, but that piece right there is worth a lot. So thank you very much.
Member Weiner.
It's interesting to reflect on power plant failure. For all GA, it's in number 3 position, but for personal flying, it's in number 2. Any insights or thoughts as to why we're seeing more power plant failures, or seem to see more power plant failures nowadays?
I can say that, first of all, I don't know what the statistics are. It may be a function of pilot training, pilot preparedness. I just don't know, but I don't have the data on that.
Member Weiner, do you have some thoughts on that issue? Because you've obviously been talking to a lot of people in the industry and the manufacturers. That's a pretty important statistic, I think, for us in GA. What do you think?
Well, I think that's a topic of some discussion, and it's not clear as to what really is the reason. In some sense, the increase in the accident rate for personal flying in general, I think, is probably due to the fact that flying has gotten to be kind of expensive, and particularly with fuel prices, there are people flying less or fewer hours than they used to fly. But it seems like the mechanical issues now are becoming more frequent than what they used to be. And I guess some perspectives from the floor or from the panel in terms of maintenance-induced errors. Do you see an increase in maintenance-induced errors nowadays compared to years back?
I'm not sure about that particular question, but you said something that triggered something in my memory that came up at our GA Safety Forum. Some of our presenters had noted that controlled flight into terrain accidents seem to be down about the same time frame that some of the new displays came in. It doesn't necessarily mean it's correlated. They're going to have to do more study on that, but it is possible. It may not be that mechanical related accidents are up. It just may be that another category is down and something's got to take its place. That's one consideration.
Yeah, that is a good point. The JSC, the Joint Steering Committee, quarterly meetings, we get a presentation by the FAA in terms of their statistics, and they've seen the CFIT accidents drop quite a bit. And the presumption is that's due to the prevalence now of TAWs on airplanes or handhelds that have databases in them which provide TAWs-like information.
But I think the issue that you initially raised, though, is counter to what we're seeing in so many other facets of transportation where the equipment has become more reliable. And so the data that you're talking about engine failures is an interesting area to explore to understand why that's happening. I know when we did our EAA work and we did our safety study on experimental aircraft, we did see that there was a high number of issues with the power plants on those. And so I think experimental aircraft are making up a larger portion of the accidents that we're seeing compared to historically. And if they're having some issues, I know we made some recommendations about testing prior to going up with those engines. But maybe Mr. DeLisi, those are some good questions for our team to ponder as you all are investigating accidents to try to understand some of this data a little bit better.
Thank you. And if I might add, just to ground us back into the concept of the safety alerts, it's certainly great to analyze the statistics, and that information can be used to develop mitigation strategies. We do that. Lots of others do that. That's certainly a positive thing. But today we're here talking about an accident in which an oil line, instead of it being replaced, it was weld repaired improperly. There's a person out there, there's a mechanic who did that. There's another one who may choose to think about doing that again sometime in the future. We're trying to reach that specific person. I doubt that person is someone who's going to be largely affected by the statistics and the generalities about the number of maintenance accidents. But if we can find a way through this alert to reach out and have them read about a fellow mechanic that made a really bad decision about doing that particular repair, maybe that's how we can break an accident chain.
I think it's probably to take that same step. There are an awful lot of pilots who take the airplane out for first flight after maintenance. I know the mechanics I've dealt with don't want to take the airplane out themselves. They allow me to do that. And for good reason. I mean, if it were a Cessna 150, probably most mechanics are qualified to fly it. If it's a Bonanza, then you have some insurance requirements for the proficiency as well as qualification of pilots. But how often do we see, or let's put it this way, what's the most prevalent problem that you folks have encountered in terms of first flights after maintenance? In other words, what should the average pilot who's now taking his airplane for a maintenance check flight to return to service, what's he most likely to find?
I don't have the exact numbers on what the most prevalent item is. But I know from personal experience and investigations, and also just being around the maintenance industry most of my life, is one, putting gas in the airplane. The airplane's right out of maintenance. They sometimes are reweighed or whatever was done, and simply they forgot to put fuel inside the airplane. Another one is FOD, or foreign objects. I honestly cannot tell you how many times I've found tools left by a mechanic inside an airplane, and they're now sitting in my toolbox at home.
Thank you, Josh. Any other comments?
I think I would just add that, first of all, we don't know about the successes, you know, the successful test flights and all that. But again, refer to Josh's presentation about a maintenance test flight is just that, a maintenance test flight. And in my experience, pilots are typically can-do types of personalities. So the airplane comes out of maintenance, they jump in the airplane, and they go on their cross-country trip. Again, it's not taking the most conservative route towards establishing that you do indeed have an airworthy aircraft, and you just jump and go. And that cuts down on the safety margins.
And a point probably worth making is on a maintenance test flight, don't plan to do an IFR departure, because that's shown up from time to time as well. Thank you very much.
Member Roskine.
Or turn it into a cross-country flight, right? I mean, that, yeah. Mr. Hune, you had a bullet that basically a lot of these maintenance issues show up as warnings. So you don't have to be an aviation maintenance whisperer to divine that there are issues going on here. So a lot of this seems to fall into risk management and decision-making. And one of the things I've really enjoyed about today is actually hearing each of you talk about, you know, your personal and professional experience. That's a heads up to the fourth panel. I'm going to do it this way, because I'm curious from each one of you, from the risk management decision-making specifically related to, are you listening to your aircraft or not? What do you think, you know, is the big change that people could make that we would really see reduction in these kinds of the examples that you've given today? From the risk management decision-making side, each have a favorite or a highlight or the take-home message?
Okay, we'll go down the row again. I have personal experience with this one, but I think it's important to remember that, you know, your aircraft only has a few little ways of communicating with you. That a catastrophic failure, even in the accidents that we see in the safety alert, it starts out small with small subtle indications that you might have an oil pressure anomaly, and you have to stop and take the subtle indications seriously. You don't keep flying it. And I think that takes a lot of discipline, because you might have an aircraft, you've got someplace you got to be. It's not convenient to be out away from your home base, leave an aircraft, rent a car, have it, you know, troubleshooting done when it might be running fine, but something's not quite right. I think that's very difficult to do, and I think that's the type of message that we want to get out. And I think that Bonanza accident and the safety alert is a great example. Something wasn't quite right, and he went. You know, he couldn't find a mechanic, and he went. And I think that happens a lot.
And just to be clear, yours is discipline to those subtle signs, right? Discipline to pay attention to those subtle signs and act on them.
Correct.
Great. And Josh, you were just talking about later this week you get to go back and start working more maintenance on yours. So
I do. Just recently finished rebuilding the engine on my airplane, and like we discussed earlier, I'm going to be doing a maintenance test flight coming most likely Thursday or Friday. And for the first 2 or 3 hours of that new engine is going to be spent above an airport, orbiting. And it's done as precaution. In case the engine quits, I have a place to land the airplane. And I think my biggest take-home is know the aircraft, know the systems of your aircraft, know what the airplane's telling you. If you have a very good, thorough understanding of how the airplane is supposed to work, and if something starts going wrong in flight, you will be able to say, I need to land now, or I need to divert. And it ultimately can save your life. I've constantly talked to many pilots after conducting local outreach talks in the Seattle area, and a lot of them come up to me and say, thank you. You hit it on the head with saying know your airplane. And I think it really pays attention to go out and get a few hours with a flight instructor, learn the systems, and go the extra mile.
I would have to echo my two colleagues' comments about pay attention to the aircraft. particularly, and avoid, it's risk management. That's what it really boils down to. And one of the things that helps, I'm an aircraft owner, I also do the work on my own airplane. One of the things that helps is understanding, as Josh said, understanding fully the systems on that airplane, knowing the possible implications and your options. And when I heard members Sumwall talking about taxiing out and a mag was rough, it flashed me back to the exact same event where I only have one engine on my airplane. Mag was rough, and there was that, I want to go on this trip, and I had to finally take the conservative course, which was taxi back and open it up.
I think both pilots and mechanics need to recognize and acknowledge the financial responsibility that they accept when they decide to own an airplane or participate in the maintenance of an airplane. Oftentimes, we find during our investigations that a pilot elected not to do maintenance because it was optional, and having to make that decision and it be a financial decision that ultimately cost them their life is something that they can't look back on retrospectively, but pilots from this point forward can, and they can appreciate if somebody suggests that you consider conducting this maintenance, you should take it seriously.
Great. And I just want to acknowledge, I know we're going to talk about this on the pilot side too, but I think it's great to do it here at the maintenance. You had a bullet on fatigue, but there's also been a lot of discussion already about distraction and other kinds of human performance issues. And it's easy to focus on those on some of the larger accidents and big systems, but every individual's got to deal with those, and they're just as relevant on the maintenance as the pilot side, for people to be thinking about making sure they're rested, they're managing their distractions, they got the right training, et cetera. And I think that was really good to include that human side of this in both the maintenance and the pilot safety alerts. Thank you.
Vice Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like to pursue further the line of questioning that Member Wayner started, because we're always hearing in this industry about concern about not enough pilots in the future. Well, I'm going to ask the same question about mechanics, because when I was a kid, I used to take the clock apart and try to put it back together. My son never did that. He was always on the computer. So I'm just wondering if you have a sense, and that's all I can really, I don't know that there's data, but do you have a sense of whether the mechanic positions are, whether we're having difficulty filling those positions? And a variation on that is, are you seeing any diminution in the quality of maintenance that you're seeing? Maybe it's not the equipment that's the problem, but maybe it's the quality of maintenance. I just wonder if any of you have any sense on either of those questions.
I'll start out with that, and then I'll let one of my colleagues speak on his experience. I do remember at last year's safety forum, we had a maintenance panel, and we had some FAA speakers on it, and we had some folks from academia that had maintenance courses in their college courses, and a Professional Aviation Maintenance Association. And the answer to that question that you just asked was all over the board from that group. There were some that were saying, here comes the shortage, and there were others in industry saying to each other, no, I'm waiting for my golden paycheck. So from within that group, there wasn't an agreement on that answer, and I'll see if anybody else has more to add to that.
I did volunteer to speak, but basically I was going to say what Kathy said. It's all over the board. We don't know. But as far as your specific question about seeing that transfer over into the accident rate or the accidents that we investigate, I can't talk to that. I don't see it, but I'm not necessarily looking for it. If it's a mechanical accident, it's typically very hard to chase all the way back to the origins of why that event occurred. That's a peculiarity of a maintenance-related event, that there's oftentimes a long period of time, a year, sometimes 2 years, between the error that is committed or omitted and the manifestation of that error. I've done several accidents like that. So trying to understand and capture the data of why that error occurred is virtually impossible.
Well, maybe a variation on that question is something that I've seen in a few manufacturers I've been to, where they commented about there is no type rating for a mechanic. So you've got type rating. If it's over 12,500 pounds, your pilot is type rated, but the mechanic who learned, dope and fabric is now fixing a whole wide variety of different kinds of airplanes, but there's nothing related to a type rating in that industry, where the pilot who goes from the Vans is also fixing the Bonanza. I mean, there's vastly different airplanes, but yet, there's no specificity on that training other than on-the-job training I've seen. Do you have any sense on whether that might be a problem regarding the increasingly complicated equipment and the inability of, you know, the dope and fabric trained mechanics, so to speak? I'm obviously overstating it, but the difficulty of a mechanic who, you know, all of whom receive very similar off-the-job training, trying to respond to this variety of increasingly complex equipment.
The only thing I can say to that is about 7 years ago, I took a summer and spent it actually turning wrenches just to see what it was like. I walked away with a great appreciation of how difficult and essentially thankless that task is. One of the problems was the work environment. You're working on a different aircraft, sometimes 3 different aircraft every day. There are numerous distractions. It's an extremely difficult environment. That's the best I can add to your question.
Anybody else?
I do know that it came up at the forum about what the practical test standards are testing and then what the mechanics in the field are facing today. And there was some discussion among that group about, you know, if it's the PTS or what it's called on the maintenance side of the house, that they'd like to see more of flexibility and evolution toward composites and some of the more modern things that mechanics are facing today and not some of the older material that's in there.
Okay, thank you very much. Fascinating panel.
Great. If I could just get a show of hands of the folks who are sitting down at the tables, how many of you all are pilots? And how many of you all are mechanics, have an A&P? So, you know, I think that is helpful for us to understand, is that there is an expectation a lot of times for that pilots understand the equipment, but they don't always have that background to be able to do that. And so I think what's particularly important, and I think Ms. Rohde talked about this in her presentation, is how much trust pilots are putting in the mechanics to do the right thing. And then there is a concurrent obligation both for pilots and mechanics to do the right thing and make the right decisions and be conservative in their risk and accept those responsibilities. And so even though I think we're talking about pilots making sure that they understand what their airplane might be saying when it's talking to them, we have to get it right on the front end with the maintenance too, because you may not always get a very communicative airplane. You know, sometimes you will. And so I think you want to pay attention to those signals. And I think Ms. Gagne, it was interesting to hear you talking about people listening when they're getting signs, because I could think of all sorts of scenarios in life, whether it's with your health of your own body or working in a workplace. There are usually early warning signs. There are usually small signals that are starting to tell you something's not going well. And I think human beings have a tendency to disregard those things many times because they see what they want to see or they believe what they want to believe, that everything's going right, whether it's a project that you're working on or a relationship. It is a challenge to pay attention to those warning signs, but I think it's a reminder that they are almost always there, and you need to be vigilant about that. I would like to recognize another important component of what we do. We're talking a lot to our regional investigators here, but Mr. Ritter's sitting at the second table, and I think particularly when we talk about these maintenance accidents or these component parts and failures, we have an incredible support team here at headquarters, and I think our RE division, the materials lab, and others do an incredible amount of work to support our team. And I know, John, in AS, we have air traffic controllers, again, who are providing support, weather support from our meteorologists, and it really does take an incredible amount of work to try to solve one of these accidents. Our regional investigators, I think, are working in very difficult conditions. I suspect we probably need almost like a military physical fitness test for some of the things that we ask you all to do, to go out in the extreme heat and the extreme cold and very difficult conditions. Some of you probably had to climb mountains to get to wreckage. And we ask you to be the Renaissance women and men of this agency. Many people here at the agency specialize in the jobs that they do, but if you go out and watch one of our regional investigators do their jobs, they are the systems team, they are the structures team, They are the human factors. They are the operations. They are the maintenance. They are all of those group chairmen. And then they're also doing public affairs. They're doing family assistance. And we ask a lot of them. And I will tell you that not a week goes by that I don't get compliments about the caliber of people that we have that work at the NTSB. And very often you go into communities where people have never had any interaction with the federal government. And you're the first face that they see and the first people that they have ever interacted with. And you all do a tremendous job. You provide a service to families, to communities, to the aviation system. And we very much appreciate that and know how hard it is. Thank you all for the work that you do, and thank you for the home team that supports all of that effort. I know it does take a lot. I did want to ask one question, and I think just because I don't have a lot of time, I know I could ask it to each one of you, and you all could come up with some information and share it with me, but I'll just ask Ms. Rohde, where are you headed to after this, and what kind of difference are you going to be making tomorrow?
I will be leaving on a flight at 8 o'clock this evening, headed to Iowa, where I will present aviation safety issues to a group of 100 agricultural pilots tomorrow.
And I suspect, Sandy Rowlett has provided me a list of many of the outreach activities that each of you all do, and I think that these are things that you all do every week. We've got people out there doing outreach, and I think, as Ms. Gagne said, being able to have someone come up who's been at one of your events and tell you that your work and your advice made a difference. We don't know about the successes all the time. We do know about the failures, but I think you all are a large part of many successes, and so thank you for that. I don't have a lot of questions for the maintenance group. I'll save what I have for the next group. Thank you all for your presentations, and we'll change panels now for the next alert on risk management for pilots. Ms. Gagne, would you like to begin?
Sure, I'll let them get seated real quick here. Our final draft safety alert, pilots, manage risks to ensure safety, addresses fatal accidents involving ineffective risk management or poor aeronautical decision-making. Although few pilots knowingly accept severe risks, accidents can result when several risks of marginal severity are not identified or are ineffectively managed by the pilot and compound into a dangerous situation. This important issue can be associated with almost any type of fatal accident across all GA sectors. Mr. Michael Hune will present the first accident scenario.
Thank you. The airplane involved was a Mooney M20, which is a non-turbocharged single-engine airplane. The accident flight was the pilot's attempt to return to his home in Minnesota after a vacation. The accident occurred while the airplane was operating on an instrument flight plan in winter weather, which included icing conditions over mountainous terrain in Wyoming. The pilot and his 3 sons were on board. All received fatal injuries. The pilot had a total time of approximately 940 hours. He had obtained his instrument rating about a year before the accident and had logged about 23 hours of actual instrument time, mostly over the relative lowlands of Minnesota. For the accident flight, the pilot was instrument current in accordance with the FARs, but his instrument requalification checkout was conducted over the course of 6 hours in 2 sessions the week before the accident. A review of the sequence of events reveals that initially the pilot utilized good risk management, but his backup plan was foiled by circumstances beyond his control. His original return trip was planned for a Sunday, the day before the accident, but he canceled that flight due to weather. He then purchased commercial airline tickets for a Monday return. However, that airline flight was canceled on Monday morning due to mechanical problems. The pilot then opted to fly his airplane home later that same day. On the day of the accident, the pilot's initial risk management efforts were manifested by his multiple weather briefings and multiple filed route changes. Those changes were due to the dynamic weather situation at the departure airport and over the mountainous terrain along the route of flight. When the pilot was finally ready to depart and was assigned his final ATC clearance, he accepted a route-altitude combination that was not in compliance with the regulations and which was near the airplane's published altitude performance limit. After departure, the pilot reported that he was having difficulty reaching his assigned altitude of 16,000 feet. Radar data indicated that the pilot achieved a maximum altitude of only about 14,500 feet. The pilot also reported that he was encountering icing conditions. For undetermined reasons, the airplane entered an uncontrolled descent, which continued until ground impact. Here's a graphic to illustrate the routes in the situation. This is a low-altitude IFR chart. The origination point, Jackson, Wyoming, is shown in blue. The first filed route via the DNW and BOY navigation facilities is shown in green. The second filed route via the DNW and RIW navigation facilities is also shown in green. Both these filed routes were on established airways. The green circle shows the minimum en route altitudes, or MEAs, for the airways, in this case 14,000 feet. The red line depicts the assigned route from ATC via the Kickney intersection direct to RIW. Note that this is an off-airway route. The red dashed circle highlights the off-route obstruction clearance altitude, known as AROCA, for the brown shaded area that the assigned clearance traversed through. The AROCA was 16,100 feet, a significant increase over the requested altitude for the non-turbocharged, fully loaded airplane. The red star depicts the approximate accident location. To provide a sense of the terrain the pilot was attempting to cross, this photograph depicts the view from the accident locale. The wreckage is shown in the inset. The NTSB determined that the probable cause of this accident was the pilot's decision to depart into known adverse weather conditions over mountainous terrain, which required operation near the limits of the airplane's performance capability. Contributing to the accident was an improper clearance issued by the air traffic controller and the pilot's acceptance of that clearance. The primary missed opportunity was that the pilot did not adhere to his initial risk management strategy. The pilot's initially conservative decision-making was overtaken by external pressures, which then adversely affected his conduct. In this case, it was the building time pressure to return home and his subsequent decision to attempt the flight. On the day of the accident, the pilot did not avail himself to postponement or cancellation alternatives, although he did so the day before. The pilot did not question the routing or altitude assigned by ATC. He accepted a clearance that was not in accordance with FAA regulations, and he accepted a flight altitude that minimized his altitude performance margins. Once he departed Jackson, the pilot failed to exercise any turnback or diversion options, and he did not explicitly ask ATC for assistance. Other lessons that can be drawn from this accident include the following. FAA legal does not necessarily equate to safe. While the pilot was legal to conduct his instrument flight, he stacked the odds against a successful flight. The combination of the pilot's limited instrument experience, his recent instrument requalifications, the weather, the terrain elevations, and the airplane capabilities presented a very challenging set of circumstances. In combination, those factors significantly increased the risk level. Pilots should accurately evaluate their skill levels and equipment capability and then follow through by aligning their options and actions with those evaluation results. Too many of the accidents that I investigate are repeat events which in retrospect were easily avoidable. Speaking as an air safety investigator who is also a pilot and an airplane owner, when I learn the details of an accident, I frequently find myself asking the question, what were they thinking about the persons involved and particularly their decision making? With alarming regularity, the best answer seems to be that at least for that particular flight, the decision-making process was far from rigorous. I wish every pilot could spend a few months as an air safety investigator. I believe that we would see their decision-making processes improve dramatically. Tying back to the overall topic of this meeting, and particularly to the risk management safety alerts, I am convinced that application of basic risk management methods would significantly reduce the number of GA accidents in this country. And I would just like to go off script for 30 seconds, comment on a remark that Chairman Hersman made, and where you categorize these as not accidents. And in fact, that's the takeaway I get in many of these events. Completely avoidable. They're not accidents. Thank you.
Thank you and good afternoon. During a return cross-country flight about midnight Central Standard Time, a twin-engine Cessna 310 impacted terrain while on a night IMC flight just short of the destination airport. The intended trip was an 85-mile return flight back to the pilot's home airfield. The area surrounding the airfield would be classified as open, flat terrain. The commercial-rated pilot was fatally injured, and the airplane was substantially damaged. The pilot
Mr. Hatch, could you pull the microphone just a little bit closer?
Sure. The pilot had flown to Oklahoma City for business and wasn't expected to stay the night. The pilot was well qualified, holding a commercial license in single and multi-engine aircraft and instructor ratings, and had about 4,300 total flight hours. The toxicology testing during the autopsy revealed 10 medications in the pilot's system, 4 of which were prescription medicines for anti-seizure and pain, and would have disqualified him for a medical certificate. A review of his personal medical records noted a history of severe migraines, including a doctor's visit about a week prior to the accident flight. The records also revealed a variety of potentially impairing medications that had been prescribed by these doctor visits. There was no record of the pilot's condition or treatments with the FAA, and the pilot held a Class 2 flight medical that was issued 7 months prior to the accident. During the day, the pilot had been in contact with family and friends, and they had told him the visibility was poor. Prior to the flight, the pilot contacted Flight Service Station and obtained a weather briefing. Again, the weather was night instrument conditions. On conversation with the briefer, the pilot stated his concern with the potential for fog. Complicating the weather briefing was the fact that the closest weather station was about 45 miles away from his home or destination airfield. The automated weather reporting station that was temporarily out of service at his destination airfield. The pilot conducted an instrument approach to the airport, however, was not able to land on the first approach. Radar data tracked the airplane's approach and showed the airplane executing the missed approach after descending to an altitude of 1,700 feet. The pilot stated to air traffic control that he'd try a second approach, that he wasn't sure a successful approach could be accomplished, adding that heavy ground fog was present. This slide represents a profile view of the second approach to the airport. The lines and altitude noted in black are information from the published approach procedure. The information noted in red is the airplane's track and altitudes taken from radar data. The airplane came to rest at a mean sea level altitude of about 1,440 feet, about a quarter mile from the end of the runway. The NTSB's probable cause was the pilot's impairment due to medication use, a migraine headache, or both, and his decision to continue the approach below minimum without the proper visual reference, resulting in the subsequent collision with terrain. Contributing to the accident was the pilot's falsification of medical information to the FAA. In looking at this accident, the pilot had both the information and experience to make the flight. The pilot had received weather information, including the potential for fog at night, and still departed on the flight and flew the approach below minimums. The pilot had potentially disqualifying medical condition that was not declared, and it was on several medications that could impair decision-making ability. In aviation, we often have acronyms that remind pilots of operational procedures. The Managed Risk Safety Alert mentions the I'm Safe acronym, and it certainly applies here. Issues of illness, medication, stress, fatigue are easily identified in this case. add in poor weather conditions, and get home itis, this flight would have been better accomplished another day. The next presenter will be Mr. Tim Sorensen.
Good afternoon. This accident involved a Cirrus SR-20 airplane that collided with trees and terrain in daylight IMC near Crystal Lake, Illinois. The intended destination was the DuPage Airport, located about 30 miles west of Chicago. The accident site was located about 22 miles north of DuPage. No flight plan had been filed, and the pilot and 3 passengers were fatally injured. Daylight VMC prevailed at the departure airport and throughout the initial portion of the flight. However, the flight encountered deteriorating weather, and the destination airport was under IFR at the time of the accident. The pilot expressed concerns to air traffic controllers about getting trapped by IFR conditions after landing. The accident pilot held a private pilot certificate. However, he did not hold an instrument rating. He had accumulated about 207 total flight hours and had recent experience in the accident airplane. When queried during the flight, the pilot informed air traffic controllers that he had been receiving instrument flight training. However, discrepancies with the pilot's logbook entries shed some doubt on the validity of his instrument flight training. There was no record that the pilot obtained an official weather briefing. Before departing on the accident flight, the pilot told a line service representative at the FBO that he was aware of the weather west of Chicago and that conditions were forecast to be VFR at their estimated time of arrival. The departure airport and initial portion of the flight were conducted under VFR. However, at the time of the flight's arrival, the intended destination airport was operating under IFR. At the time of the accident, local airports were reporting marginal VFR conditions. Incidentally, as the flight entered the Chicago terminal area, the airplane passed southwest of Midway Airport, which was reporting marginal VFR conditions. Air traffic control radar data provided information about the accident airplane's route of flight. This map shows the flight path in blue overlaid onto an aeronautical chart. The flight entered the Chicago terminal area south of Midway Airport and proceeded on a northwest course to a point about 5 miles south of DuPage Airport, where the pilot turned north. The pilot inquired about landing at DuPage, but was advised that the airport was under instrument flight rules. After the pilot inadvertently overflew the airport, the controller issued a landing clearance to the pilot. The pilot ultimately elected not to land at DuPage, citing his concerns about getting trapped by the weather. This slide depicts the meandering path of the accident flight subsequent to his contact with the DuPage Tower controller. The pilot flew north from DuPage Airport and was handed off to Chicago Approach Control. The approach controller provided weather conditions at local airports, and the pilot indicated that he would proceed to an airport where VFR conditions were reported. However, the pilot later decided against that plan, informing the controller that he didn't want to mess with the weather and he didn't want to get stuck. The radar data depicted the accident airplane subsequently entering a right-hand descending spiral. A witness reported hearing an airplane that sounded like the pilot was doing aerobatics, but he was not able to see it because of the cloud cover. Shortly afterward, he observed the airplane below the clouds in a 70-degree nose-down attitude before it struck the ground. A second witness also described the sound of an airplane in aerobatic flight. She then observed the accident airplane exit the clouds in a nose-down attitude. A post-accident examination determined that the airframe parachute likely deployed as a result of the impact. The NTSB determined that the probable cause of this accident was the non-instrument rated pilot's decision to continue flight in IMC, which resulted in the pilot's spatial disorientation and loss of control of the airplane. There are a number of lessons that other pilots can learn in order to prevent accidents due to continued flight into IMC. First, there was no record that the pilot obtained an official weather briefing. Although he was reportedly aware of adverse weather in the vicinity of the destination airport, the investigation was unable to confirm the scope or adequacy of any weather information he may have obtained before the flight. Based on his indecision exhibited during the flight, it seems likely that he did not consider alternatives in the event the flight could not be completed as planned. The pilot repeatedly expressed a concern about getting stuck by the weather. It seems clear that the pilot's schedule did not allow for a delay in the planned itinerary. Possibly because of this, the pilot failed to deviate to any of several airports in the area that were reporting VFR conditions. In addition, he had the option of returning along the initial flight path where weather conditions were better. Finally, the pilot did not seem aware that weather conditions were not conducive to VFR operations at the destination airport. Although the pilot could have requested a special VFR clearance in order to land and take off, for some reason he did not do so. This accident illustrates that marginal weather conditions require more detailed pre-flight planning, which should include obtaining an official weather briefing, identifying specific alternatives to the flight itinerary in the event that the flight cannot be completed as initially planned, identifying specific alternatives to personal plans in the event of a flight deviation, and finally, pilots must have the discipline to deviate to an alternate airport based solely on safety of flight considerations and not on any personal constraints.
The 3 accidents that staff just presented are summarized in the draft safety alert. Pilots manage risks to ensure safety. The safety alert also provides links to educational resources, including some risk management checklists, and it offers pilots the following advice.
Understand that effective risk management takes practice. Risk management is a decision-making process by which you can systematically identify hazards, assess the degree of risk, and determine the best course of action. Understand the safety hazards associated with human fatigue and strive to eliminate fatigue contributors in your life.
Be honest with yourself and the FAA about your medical condition. If you have a medical condition or are taking medication, do not fly until your fitness for flight has been thoroughly evaluated. Develop good making practices that will allow you to identify personal attitudes that are hazardous to safe flying. Apply behavior modification techniques, recognize and cope with stress, and effectively use all resources.
Be honest with yourself and your passengers about your skill level and proficiency. Refuse to allow external pressures, such as the desire to save time or money, or the fear of disappointing passengers, to influence you to attempt or continue a flight in conditions in which you are not comfortable. Plan ahead with flight diversion or cancellation alternatives, and brief your passengers about the alternatives before the flight. This concludes the staff presentations on this safety alert. We are prepared to answer your questions at this time.
Thank you all very much for your presentations. We'll turn to questions. Member Sumwalt.
Thank you. Of course, we're talking about risk management, and I find that sometimes people, when you talk about risk management, their eyes glaze over. And so a definition that I like of risk management comes from the FAA's System Safety Handbook, and it says that we manage risk whenever we modify the way that we do something to increase the chances of success while decreasing the chances of injury, failure, or loss. And I think that's a really good definition there, that we modify the way that we do something to increase the chances of success while decreasing the chances of injury, failure, or loss. And so how do you start out on there? You look for the things that can bite you. What are the things that can hurt us? Well, it's IMC, or it's icing conditions. Whatever it is, you look for those things that can hurt you. Those are called hazards. And then you say, can those hazards hurt me? Well, yeah. And then you try to assess the likelihood that you'll encounter that hazard. And so it's not rocket science. We're not talking about coming out and, you know, when we hear about the FAA doing risk management on certification, they're talking about is something 10 to the minus ninth or something like that in the level in terms of how the likelihood that that part might break. It's very simple. We just list the things that can hurt us, and then figure out ways that we can manage those risks. And so I don't want people to think that it's rocket science. It's not hard. We practice risk management, hopefully, in our everyday lives, but let's apply it to an aviation context. Thank you.
Member Weiner.
Well, I thank you for addressing the risk management issues on these last two topics, both on the mechanic side and on the pilot side. I've often felt that it was easier to teach somebody how to actually physically fly an airplane than it was to impart some level of judgment that allowed them to make the right decisions. Following on Member Sumwald's notion of risk management, I think one of the big successes that that they've had in the 121 arena is threat and error management, which is really just another, in my mind, packaging of risk management. But threat and error management, to me, seems a little more visceral. Threats can be identified, and beforehand, you decide what threats you're going to deal with, what threats you're going to mitigate, and how you're going to mitigate them. And I would really like to see the threat and error management construct adapted to the Part 91 kind of operations. Any thoughts from the panel?
Well, perhaps we're taking the first step towards that today by highlighting this in a safety alert and trying to inject that into the flying community.
If you look back at pretty much all of the accidents that you've used, and it's what, there's been 15 different episodes or 15 different accidents. Almost all of those had some element of risk management involved. And I think if you go back and look at accidents in general, risk management would have affected the outcome of almost all these accidents. But thank you for bringing this topic up. Member Erskine.
Mr. Hune, I'm going to follow you off script for a minute because I think the chairman brought it up as a great point, which is, you know, on the roadways, it's all about crashes. And philosophically and conceptually, they've been away from accidents for a long time. And it's not about blame so much as the error chain and where do you intervene. So I think what's kind of interesting, and we don't have to talk about it, but I think what you're raising is, you know, it's all about accidents, though, in aviation. And again, is there a parallel conceptual and philosophical change maybe that needs to take place when especially we are so good at identifying that error chain where interventions could really make a difference that maybe we need to start thinking about changing our terminology a little bit. So my question for you folks, I've been very fortunate over my career to talk and get to know a lot of colleagues and friends that are high-performance pilots, walking on the moon and high-hour shuttle folks and legendary acrobatic and test pilots. And, you know, their lessons learned, when they make mistakes, they always talk about going back to their GA airplane. You know, that they want to go back, and whether it's stick and rudder stuff and the manual skills, the bigger one they always focus on is the risk management decision making. And Member Weiner was just talking about this, that the skill part is sort of very straightforward in how you pull it apart, teach the elements, et cetera. The harder is the decision making, the judgment, et cetera. So I'm kind of curious, last panel, I love hearing from everybody. So for each of you, you know, if there's one thing you'd want every pilot out there, whatever their experience level, but we're focused on GA, you know, that was their risk management tool that would be the first thing, the first risk management strategy in their head, you know, that could make a difference tomorrow when they fly, what would that be?
I guess we'll just go down the line. I'd like them to start with a personal minimums checklist, and I think the alternative plan for diversion or cancellation is a big part of that.
I think general aviation, unlike the 121 operations, is essentially single string operations. which means there's very limited redundancy. So there's more individual responsibility in the pilots and mechanics. The only way to prevent the bad things, the undesired outcomes from happening, is risk management. And it's identifying, as Member Sumwalt says, identifying the choices that are there, the possible threats, and figuring out how to mitigate or strategize against them. That's the simple answer. Putting it into practice is extremely difficult.
Do you have any thoughts about that? I mean, I think that's the other challenge, right?
Right.
We can give
Personally,
it bullets, but
I don't use checklists. Like, you know, I do use checklists. Don't misquote me on that one. Before every flight I conduct, I consciously try to identify the potential threats. Where can this go off the tracks, if you will, and figure out what are my alternatives. And there are many times where I just don't get in the airplane, or I don't go to the destination one. So it's a personal identification and just stepping through what are my options and what are the impacts of those decisions.
Mr. Hatch.
Yeah, I like to think that we're not advocating necessarily that every flight has to be day VFR, no wind conditions. That's a bit idealistic, though nice. I think echoing what Mike said, identifying every flight, what conditions there in front of you, night, IMC, am I fatigued, have I spent all day doing work or flying and that kind of stuff, and then identifying what are the risk mitigation procedures. And then I think the key at the end of the day on any of those is not compounding one bad decision into another ones. And if you looked at the accidents that we brought before you, it wasn't one bad decision. It was a continuing chain of a bad decision gone after another bad decision that leads to the accident. So the ultimate goal is to break that chain.
And I guess if there's one thing I could, or that stands out to me is for the flight instructing community, for it to be incumbent upon them as they come and contact you with a primary student or an advanced student to point out the risk factors, to point out what decisions you can make, what you can do to mitigate those issues. You know, as far as getting into IMC, I, remember very vividly 1 hour being under the hood as a student pilot, get myself into a 45-degree bank turn, and it felt perfectly fine. Felt like I was straight and level. And I give my flight instructor a lot of credit because it was VFR, I was under the hood. He didn't say a word. He let me figure it out, and it was everything I could do to right that airplane and trust the instruments. But it taught me, very vividly right off the bat how seriously you have to take some of these flights and some of these operations. So that would be my comment.
And just if I can summarize a little bit, it's most of you focused on the pre-flight before you ever, it's a 0-1 go, no-go kind of thing before you ever get in there. And second, if you do, that you kind of know what's coming, including being at a bank angle you don't necessarily sort of had planned for, et cetera. So I like that. Two very clear, straightforward take-home messages. Thanks.
Vice Chairman.
Thank you. You've certainly saved the most difficult subject to last. I mean, this is what in the 121 arena we call professionalism. The problem is in this arena there is no backup check from anybody else about, in commercial aviation, you got a lot of people in the decision loop. In GA, it's just the pilot. And so you certainly picked the toughest one. It's not anywhere in your training. It's not anywhere in the biannual flight review. It's nowhere in the official FAA regimen. There's nothing to measure or ascertain or judge based upon risk management skills. And that's completely lacking from the picture. And so it comes down to personal judgment, and we're all struggling with how to reach the unreachable, so to speak, and how to get people to make this better personal judgment. It just breaks my heart to see father and his 3 kids. Wow. So having said that, thank you for bringing it up. The only thing that I know is just to keep pounding and pounding and pounding, keep pushing at this, because none of us have a real good answer to how to provide the backup for that situation that is not covered at all by the regulatory framework. And I'm not sure it could be, actually, but, like I say, in 121, there's so many other people in the decision-making process, you don't have that in general aviation. Having said that, just have a few micro questions. One was that 310 accident looked very, very survivable. It kind of surprised me that that led to a fatality. I'm just curious. This is, as I say, this is a micro question. Did that, A, was his belt on, and B, did he have shoulder straps? I mean, it just looked so survivable. I'm surprised there was a fatality.
I would say the photograph is maybe a little bit misleading. It was much like skipping a rock on a lake, I think, was the actual impact. And as such, what you didn't see in the photograph there was actually the seat separated from the aircraft, and he and the seat was outside the aircraft. And I think in that particular model of Cessna, the seat belts are actually fastened to the seat and not the airframe. And I think that's a change in certification now. But
okay, that you're right. That wasn't apparent from the picture. Questions about the Mooney accident. You mentioned that it's not turbocharged, so that altitude was obviously a challenge. But I'm wondering, was he based in Minnesota? That's where you mentioned he had a lot of the training.
He lived and learned to fly in Minnesota. Most of his experience was in, as I called it, the relative lowlands. So
then my next question is, did he have oxygen on board? Because
he did have oxygen.
He did have oxygen on board. Okay. Was it a day? I didn't get whether that was day or night.
It was a day flight.
Okay. Okay. Well, again, this is the toughest one. I don't have a good answer. You know, I'm just ruminating because it's a tough one. I mean, we all go through those same decisions every time we fly, and it just comes down to personal judgment. And you know, kudos to you for pursuing this, because I hope we can come up with a better way. Thank you very much.
I wonder how many of us that have taken commercial transportation in the last year have been delayed or had our flight arrangements changed because of weather or because of a mechanical, I don't know, maybe a show of hands. And the board members can participate in this as well. I mean, I know I have, and the reflection down there is that almost all of our staff have. And again, I think this goes back. We often try to draw comparisons and parallels between commercial aviation and general aviation. Why do those things happen in commercial aviation? And it goes to what the vice chairman was commenting on, because they have a system, because they have a structure, because they have hard stops, they have expectations, they have other people in the decision-making loop, and decisions are made that disappoint people. Decisions are made that frustrate plans. Many of us have missed things because of those flight changes or delays. And so I think that the lesson that we take from that is also a part of flying that everyone has to accept. It has to be, again, you might not get to where you're going. And it is amazing to me when I'm sitting in the back of one of those planes and a plane is taxiing out, they turn around because they have a maintenance problem or they have a delay of some sort, and how frustrated everyone on the airplane gets when the pilot announces it. It's a collective groan. Well, as a safety professional, my response is like, thank you. And I think that's the challenge, that as human beings, that expectation, that disappointment. So just think about what that pilot is feeling with the plane full of his friends or family or other things. He's not isolated by that cockpit door. He doesn't have a dispatch that's telling him this is what you have to do or this is the decision that's made. He might be taking off from an uncontrolled facility. He might not have gotten weather. These are all, I think, very, very difficult issues. As the vice chairman was saying, these are individual choices that people make. How do we instill and drive down, not necessarily a checklist, Mr. Hune, but the discipline that we need to see to get the right decisions to be made? And I think at the core of it is understanding why human beings are not good at risk assessment. What compels people to make the wrong decision or to make multiple wrong decisions, I think, as Mr. Hatch was talking about, and compound it? How do we address that, and how do we communicate about that, and how do we get people to change those behaviors? It is very difficult. We deal with this in all modes of transportation, people texting or talking on the phone. Logically, we all know that's probably not a good idea, but yet people still feel compelled to undertake behaviors that increase their risk. How do we communicate about those things in an effective way? Mr. Hatch's presentation reminded me that, Mr. Ritter, I'm I had written it down, but I meant to say our medical officers, Drs. Garber and Duncan and McKay, unbelievable assets to us and to all of our team. It's really important for us to also understand those medical issues too. But I did want to ask a question to Mr. DeLisi, and that's about what is a safety accomplishment. I mentioned in my opening that we've had 400 safety accomplishments in the last 4 years. Could you maybe just share a little bit with us about what those safety accomplishments are?
Sure, thanks. There's 3 different levels of achieving a safety improvement as a result of our accident. The first level is called a safety result. That's an action that's just very logical that gets taken as a result of an accident that we've investigated, and we capture those and note them in the accident brief. The next level is a safety accomplishment. That's where one of our investigators can suggest a course of action, make perhaps a local suggestion for an improvement, begin the ball rolling to a manufacturer, to an operator to think about a certain improvement that can be taken, and through just a suggestion that gains some traction and that action gets taken. We award safety accomplishments to our investigators who can suggest that type of corrective action. And then the third level is the safety recommendation, the biggest hammer that we have. And I did just want to point out today, we are bringing these safety alerts to the board. We think it's a creative new way to try to get the word directly to the pilots and the mechanics involved in general aviation. What we didn't bring to the board today was a package of safety recommendations. These are not regulatory changes. We're not looking for rulemaking. We don't think that's the effective way to reach this population. So the safety alert is a new technique to try to use to get there.
And thank you so much, Mr. DeLisi. I know we've had safety accomplishments that include changes at airports. They include changes to maintenance procedures or manuals or flight school operating procedures, service bulletins by manufacturers. And I think in many ways this is actually also the strength of our party process of having everyone at the table with our investigators to be able to see some of the things that we're seeing so they can take immediate action. We don't need to issue a recommendation, and these changes occur automatically. And so again, whether you all have to cajole or encourage or guilt people into making these changes, these 400 safety accomplishments, they are equivalent to the recommendations that we issue every year. We close about 100 recommendations every year, and your average on safety accomplishments in many ways is much more direct at making these changes and much more effective. And so thank you all for the work that you do on that. Mr. DeLisi and Member Wayner, thank you for your leadership on general aviation safety issues and trying to figure out different ways to reach the reachable. Of course, we have a lot of people who are interested in hearing the safety messages, but also the unreachable. And I know, Mr. DeLisi, you have some plans about how to get some information out in the future, and we very much look forward to that taking place. Mr. Hune, I'm reminded of a conversation that we had many years ago. It was when you were still out in Ashburn, and I remember speaking with you and a number of other regional investigators and how frustrated you were. And it made a big impression that you felt that we spent a lot of time and a lot of resources investigating these accidents, and we didn't get a lot of safety payoff for that work that we did. And I know that you all are completely committed to the mission that we do and that you go out and you investigate each of these accidents, but you are frustrated when you see the same things happen over and over again, things that could have been prevented. And so I'm really psyched that today we had an opportunity to hear from you all about what you do and hear about your experiences and your observations. And while I know this won't solve many of the problems that we have, hopefully it will be one step in moving us in the right direction. Our regional investigators represent 1 out of every 8 employees at the NTSB, and they do a tremendous service for the aviation community. We just want to figure out how to make your message and the information that you develop more effectively transmitted to the community. I think one of the challenges for us as an agency, too, is with budget cuts and the sequester. We've already made some decisions about things that are discretionary, and travel is one of those things that's been a difficult decision for us, and I know that that impacts the advocacy message, and it makes it more difficult for us to get our message out and our recommendations and our alerts out. And so we are going to have to figure out how we do that. I think producing the videos and allow others to be our force multiplier and get those out is one way. But I think as we continue to face difficult times with our budget, it is going to be a challenge for Mr. DeLisi and his team about decisions about who goes out and how many people go out, as it will be a challenge for the board members too. So I think these types of pressures are felt across the agency because, as you can see, we don't have a lot of people in this room listening to the message, and we know it's much more effective to take it to them and in their communities and their homes, so their home airports. So we look forward to figuring out ways to do that under the constraints that we're living in. So thank you all so much for your presentations. I think we now will move to vote on the safety alerts. We have 5 alerts before us. The board members have had an opportunity to consider them. And if one of the board members would like to make a motion to adopt the alerts, I don't think we have any amendments pending. It's been so moved and seconded to adopt the 5 safety alerts proposed by the staff regarding GA safety. All those in favor signal with a hand and aye. Aye, 5 ayes. The alerts have been unanimously adopted. On behalf of all of us, all of the board members, I'd like to thank the Office of Aviation Safety, the Office of Research Engineering, the Office of Communications, and all of the people at the board who are going to work not only to put the information together, but get the information out, because that is part of our mission as well. Thank you to Kathy Gagne, Chris Shaver, Jennifer Rohde, Craig Hatch, Tim Sorensen, Dennis Diaz, Mike Hune, Elliot Simpson, Josh Kothra, and our editor, Nicole Coleman. Improving GA safety is a big challenge. It's one that Member Wayner has certainly taken on, and all of the other board members, I think, are in support of that action, and we all learned a lot from the 2 forums that we held last summer. The nation's population of pilots and mechanics is immense. 617,000 active pilots and 335,000 active mechanics. As we heard at last summer's GA Safety Forum, only a small portion of these are taking online courses or attending safety seminars. So much of general aviation is a world apart from air carriers, which have training departments, safety officers, safety management systems. GA is essentially an airline or maintenance operation of one, which puts the responsibility for sound decision making on one person's shoulders. We are promoting and distributing the alerts to reach those pilots and mechanics who can benefit from this life-saving message. The NTSB is also embracing a number of new outreach methods, including videos that feature our accident investigators. Philosopher George Santayana could have been writing about GA safety when he wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Let's break this senseless cycle of tragic loss in our GA community, and let's start today. We stand adjourned.